Max came to drag back his bride and found her in the arms of Providence' most feared man. He arrived at the Gallo estate with 5 men, legal threats, and the arrogance of someone who still believed Audrey belonged to him. But Silvio walked out with a rifle on his shoulder and a smile cold enough to stop blood. Then Audrey stepped beside him, looked her ex-fiancé in the eye, and said the words that destroyed his control. "You don't want me back, Max. You want your reputation back."
Let us step into this freezing downpour together, right into the frame where our tragedy begins. The camera pans to 25-year-old Audrey, her breath tearing through her chest as she sprints across the soaked pavement. Her heavy silk gown drags through the black puddles, ruined like the future she is escaping. With a violent pull, she rips the veil from her hair, discarding it like a rusted chain. In the blur of the rain, Max screams his venom into the night. It is a harsh truth sometimes. The most courageous act a broken soul can manage is simply to run away before promise destroys you. Driven by raw adrenaline, she throws her weight against the heavy doors of an ancient sanctuary. She believes she is finding a silent refuge, but she is plunging headfirst into the iron grip of the most ruthless crime syndicate in Providence. The camera lingers on Audrey as she stumbles into the dim, suffocating air of the cathedral. Cold mud drips from her torn lace onto the pristine marble floor, and in that instant, her blood freezes. She has just crashed a mafia funeral. Rows of hardened, silent men in dark tailored suits slowly turn their heads, their eyes locking onto the trembling bride. 2 massive enforcers glide past her like shadows, pulling the heavy oak doors shut until the deadbolts echo with a terrifying click. Outside, Max begins violently pounding on the wood. We must remember this painful lesson. Never let someone else dictate your worth, especially a coward who treats your devotion as a backup plan. While Max howls in the rain over his shattered vanity, Audrey stands trapped in the sanctuary, inhaling the very same air as ruthless killers. Her panicked gaze slowly tracks back toward the altar, and the lens focuses entirely on him. Silvio Gallo moves down the center aisle with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a man who commands the shadows. His features are brutally sharp, carved from marble and ancient violence. His pale blue eyes possess a cruel clarity, stripping away every secret she tries to hide. He stops so dangerously close that Audrey must tilt her chin back just to meet his stare. His gaze drags over her ruined gown and bruised feet, and a dark, arrogant smirk curves his lips. He labels her a runaway bride, his baritone voice vibrating through the quiet, hollow church. The universe often places a terrifying obstacle in your path simply to forcefully redirect you toward your true destiny. She can barely breathe under his suffocating presence, yet her trembling chin remains lifted. Audrey stares directly into the eyes of this underworld king, the sheer desperation making her voice tremble as she pleads for a quiet exit. But Silvio merely studies her pale face, the gears of a dark machination turning in his mien. He murmurs that he needed an immediate solution, and she arrived dressed perfectly for the part. As deep confusion grips her, he tilts his head toward the violently rattling doors and softly asks who is hunting her. The very second she whispers the name Max Gordon, the temperature in the cathedral plummets. Silvio repeats the name, his tone dripping with ancient, venomous hatred. This serves as a chilling reminder: the people we think we understand often conceal the most destructive histories. Silvio extends a scarred hand toward her, commanding her to walk with him into the abyss, just as Max screams a final threat outside. Now, stick with me through this scene, because the tension in this sanctuary is entirely suffocating. Our desperate bride stares down at his outstretched hand, naively believing he is offering a simple back door. Suddenly, the brass handle of the entrance shakes with a violent, aggressive fury, the unmistakable sound of a man attempting to claim his property. We must embrace this raw truth. Leaping blindly into the dark unknown is frequently safer than remaining in the arms of a familiar demon. With no safety net left, she places her trembling, mud-stained fingers into his scarred palm. The camera follows them down the long aisle, gliding past armed sentinels and a polished casket heavy with the tragic scent of lilies. Suddenly, a man sharing the same harsh jawline rises from the pews. Aldo glares, his voice slicing through the grief to demand answers. Silvio slowly turns his head toward his brother with an agonizing, unhurried patience, treating Aldo like a mere trick of the light. Without ever raising his low baritone, he casually announces to the room that he is getting married today. The sheer audacity of his words echoes off the vaulted stone ceilings like a gunshot. Audrey freezes completely. She feels the dangerous, searing heat of his palm and realizes this ruthless stranger has just rewritten her entire destiny. Listen to this closely. You must never surrender the pen to your own life story, no matter how intimidating the person holding the ink may appear. With a sudden burst of defiance, she yanks her hand away, fiercely reminding him that he promised her an escape. Silvio merely locks those pale, freezing eyes onto hers, calmly whispering that he is handing her the exact exit she prayed for. The sheer, suffocating madness of the situation finally shatters her restraint. She snaps at him, her voice cracking, pointing out that he just claimed her as his bride without even knowing her name. Silvio merely tilts his head, that dark, arrogant smirk returning to his lips, and softly breathes out that he presumes she is Audrey. Her chest heaves as she fires right back, violently refusing to trade one gilded cage for another. It is a tragic reality. We must all confront escaping a prison means absolutely nothing if you simply lock yourself inside a different cell. Silvio steps into a personal space, his imposing frame offering a brutal ultimatum. She can walk back to the toxic coward outside, or leave this altar under his blood-soaked protection. The heavy doors shudder violently as Max kicks them. Silvio watches the wood splinter, deeply entertained. A suffocating wave of pure desperation crashes over Audrey as she begs him to simply unlock a side door. She frantically warns him that if he truly understands who Max Gordon is, he might know the man will never let this public insult go unpunished. Silvio looks right through her rising panic, his voice dropping to a smooth, terrifying hum as he agrees that Max will not walk away. Completely cornered in the shadows of the cathedral, she demands he let her face the ruin alone. Instead, he simply offers his scarred hand once more. Real courage is never the absence of fear. It is making a terrifying choice when every safe harbor has burned to ash. Her heart hammers violently against her ribs as she places her fingers in his. Then, the devastating realization drops like a guillotine. He is Silvio Gallo, a name that represents a dynasty forged in blood and eternal tragedy. The cold, damp stone seems to bite at her bare feet as the horrifying cinematic reality washes over her mind. She has not stumbled into a random gathering of grief. She is standing over the polished casket of the reigning Mafia king. The grieving son, now the newly crowned Don, observes her with an absolute, unnerving stillness. He softly explains his grim position. He desperately requires a wife to solidify his power, and her pathetic ex requires a brutal, fatal lesson in respect. It is a perfect, violent collision of their tragedies. Max's demanding voice bleeds through the ancient walls, a ghost of her past mistakes. Audrey tries to pull back, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the Gallo bloodline. But Silvio Tridu flashes a wild, dark smile, his fingers wrapping her wrist in iron. Remember this, sometimes the most terrifying leap into the dark is the only way to survive. Let us pause and really examine the agonizing framing of this moment together. The cathedral air is thick, choking on the scent of burning wax, lilies, and profound sorrow. Audrey stands trembling at the center, her ruined wedding gown draped across the marble. Like the ghost of a murdered dream, two massive enforcers step forward from the shadows to serve as witnesses, while an aging, terrified priest opens his leather-bound book, knowing better than to question a gallows. Silvio leans in close, the dangerous heat of his breath brushing her ear as he urges her to simply say the word. But she refuses to break entirely, demanding his protection while drawing a rigid boundary around her independence. It proves that even in your darkest hour, you must fiercely protect your self-worth. Silvio gives a single, heavy nod, sealing an unbreakable, tragic pact in the shadows. She blocks out the nervous, trembling Latin prayers of the priest, focusing her mind entirely on the muffled, pathetic shouts of the man who shattered her trust. For 2 agonizing years, she had shrunk her own vibrant soul just to keep that selfish coward comfortable, and her sacrifice this deed ends today. Lifting her chin in an act of pure cinematic defiance, she looks the grieving Mafia Heir in the eye and speaks her vows with a voice of absolute stone. Silvio immediately slides a heavy, freezing gold signet ring onto her finger, deliberately turning the brutal family crest inward against her sensitive palm. It is a fabricated union, yet the heavy weight of that metal feels terrifyingly real, he murmurs, his voice a dark caress that she is a gallows. Now, as he leads her down the aisle, remember this: the most devastating revenge is choosing your own dangerous power over a miserable life. The heavy oak doors swing outward with a heavy groan, revealing Max standing in the vestibule, dripping wet and utterly bewildered. Silvio does not miss a single beat, his dark baritone voice laced with a lethal amusement as he casually announces he has found the lost bride. The camera pushes in on Max, and you can practically see the panic math running behind his eyes as he calculates the total ruin of his social reputation. He barks a harsh order for Audrey to heel like a dog, complaining bitterly about his 300 wealthy guests. But Silvio raises one commanding hand, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. He introduces himself softly, then drops the devastating reality that Audrey is now his wife. He commands Max to watch his tone when addressing Audrey Gallo. The silence is absolute. Bullies will always roar until they are forced to look real power in the eye. Let us unpack the sheer gravity of this final frame together. Max stands entirely defeated, his previous rage dissolving into a weak, pathetic stammer as he begs to know what she has done. Audrey tightens her trembling fingers around the Don's hand, pulling a cold, undeniable strength from the beautiful monster beside her. She locks her gaze onto the man who shattered her just hours ago, her voice cutting through the damp air with an icy, tragic clarity. She is still a bride, she tells him, just not his. You can watch the color entirely drain from Max's face as the woman he believed he owned publicly discards him into the rain. Silvio hardly moves, offering a microscopic nod that summons his enforcers from the shadows. He smoothly advises Max to walk away before the weather turns fatal. It is a beautiful, brutal truth: when you refuse to tolerate disrespect, the trash takes itself out. The heavy oak doors swing shut with a hollow thud, sealing away the ghost of a ruined life. Silvio stands perfectly still in the dim hallway light, his thumb slowly tracing the white, trembling knuckles of Audrey. He acts as if tearing two families apart was merely a minor bump in his schedule. He quietly tells her to dry her eyes, and only then does the wetness on her cheeks register. A slow, mocking clap bounces off the stone walls. His brother Aldo steps from the shadows, his face twisted in pure contempt, calling it a touching performance for a funeral. Silvio does not flinch, his grip tightens. He stares his brother down with chilling calm. We all face moments designed to break our spirit entirely. But holding your composure steady when the world screams for you to shatter is the only true victory. Silvio never looks back as he guides her out into the blinding daylight. The brutal reality hits Audrey all at once. The man she once loved saw her as a burden, and now she is bound to a crime boss whose name makes the city hold its breath. You and I know exactly how terrifying it is to lose control of your own story. She sits frozen in his limousine. The platinum ring feels like ice against her skin. Her bare feet hide beneath the muddy hem of her ruined white dress. The weight of his dark gaze becomes suffocating. She snaps, demanding he stops staring, asking if he has never seen a barefoot woman before. Silvio leans back into the leather, totally at ease, and murmurs he has never seen one quite like her. Taking a blind leap into the absolute dark is often the only real way to find your true strength. Audrey shifts against the plush leather seats, pretending not to care as the grey city blurs past the tinted glass. Without any warning, Silvio leans closer. His heat radiates against her shivering shoulder before his deep voice whispers that she still looks beautiful. Her throat goes completely dry. She forces her wide eyes to stay locked on the passing window, terrified that looking into his face might undo her last shred of strength. The massive car soon stops before towering iron gates that part like a dark theater curtain. The estate stands as a monument to old money and silent violence, a stone fortress brooding over a grey, endless ocean. 5 security cars glide behind them in perfect formation. Keeping your guard high is often the only way to protect your heart when life drops you into a dangerous new world. The heavy car door swings open to the biting, salty air. Audrey steps out, but the second her bare heel meets the unforgiving, crushed gravel, a sharp gasp escapes her trembling lips. Before she can react, Silvio is already there. With a quiet grace, he sweeps her into his arms, carrying her toward the mansion as if she weighs absolutely nothing. Her frantic hands grab the fabric of his tailored dark suit. Her voice shakes as she asks what he is doing. He does not even blink, calmly asking if she would rather bleed all over his driveway. He carries her up the massive stone steps, pausing just outside the grand doorway. A faint smile finally touches his lips as he mutters that he is a traditional man at heart. We often learn the hard way that the people who seem the most dangerous are sometimes the only ones strong enough to carry us. The grand entrance hall feels incredibly suffocating. 5 rigid staff members stand at absolute attention as Silvio sheds his dark jacket. His voice is a low hum, yet it commands every shadow in the room. He declares her the new mistress of the house, demanding their absolute respect. 5 heads dip in a chilling, silent vow of loyalty. Audrey stands frozen, her arms crossed tight to hold her trembling body together. She whispers that her parents are still at the venue, exposed to her furious ex. Silvio slowly loosens his silk tie, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He states that the man knows exactly what it would cost to touch anything belonging to him. That possessive, cold tone sends a severe warning shiver down her spine. A single choice made in sheer panic will often bind us to a tragic destiny far heavier than we ever expected to carry. Silvio brushes off her career with the casual indifference of a man who owns the world. When Audrey admits her boss is her ex, a dangerous smirk touches his lips. Her resignation, he declares smoothly, is already accepted. Before the shock can truly settle into her bones, the heavy double doors swing wide. Aldo strolls in, his twisted laughter echoing as he eyes her ruined dress. He loudly mocks Silvio for stealing the spotlight at their own father's funeral. Aldo studies Audrey with pale blue eyes that perfectly mirror his brother's, yet hold a chilling, distinct kind of venom. She stands entirely frozen, finally seeing the toxic bloodline she just bound her life to. It is a harsh reality of human nature. Running away from one painful fire will often drop you directly into the burning heart of another. The oxygen drains instantly from the room. The moment Aldo steps closer, he leans down, his gaze scanning Audrey like a cheap trinket he just dug out of the mud. He mutters about cleaning her up, his pale hand reaching out for her tangled hair. She jerks back in pure terror. In a fraction of a second, Silvio is standing right there. "Hands, Aldo," he warns. His voice is a low, dangerous rumble, the exact kind of quiet tone that promises absolute destruction. He reminds him she is a gallo now. Aldo simply flashes a cold smirk, throwing his hands up in a fake surrender. He drops one last mocking insult about his brother's taste before turning his back to walk away. It is a harsh truth to swallow in this bitter life. Certain people will constantly test your boundaries just to see where they snap, and planting your feet firmly is your only real shield. "He is a bit rough in bed," Aldo whispers, his cruel words sliding into her ear like a cold snake. He pulls back with a dead, empty smile, casually adding that they are still burying their father today. The massive door thuds shut behind him, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Audrey stands frozen, her jaw clamped tight enough to crack bone. Beside her, Silvio breaks the thick quiet without a single drop of empathy. "That is how Aldo says hello," he states flatly. "Give it a week." She turns and stares at him, utterly lost in this dark nightmare. Is this entire family completely broken? Too exhausted to fight, she numbly asks a maid for a room. Silvio orders her suite prepared instantly, throwing her a dark wink before walking away. People will always make excuses for the poison in their own bloodline. When they do, your best move is to simply hold your ground. Everything she needs, Silvio barks to the staff. "Clothes, shoes, I want it here in 1 hour." Audrey lets out a shaky breath, feeling trapped inside a beautiful, dark tragedy. Halfway up the curving staircase, his sharp voice stops her cold. "Mrs. Gallo," he says, holding out his phone, "call your family. Tell them you are safe." The bedroom she is given is nothing but a gorgeous, silk-lined cage. She sits on the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at the glowing screen. She is wearing a mob boss's name now. She dials, and her mother's voice spills out in pure panic, crying about the ruined wedding and the chaos left behind. You and I have probably both felt that exact kind of sudden helplessness. Sometimes life throws you straight into the dark water, and you just have to learn how to swim before the current drags you under. "Mom, please listen," Audrey pleads, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "I could not marry Max. I got married this morning to someone else." The silence on the line is heavy enough to crush bone. Her mother's voice finally cracks with pure, horrified disbelief. Audrey begs her not to call the police, promises blindly to explain later, and quickly hangs up. The beautiful bedroom feels entirely suffocating, the air thick and hard to breathe. All she wants is a scalding hot shower to wash the trauma away. But this violent world does not offer rest. The sharp, violent crack of gunfire suddenly shatters the quiet afternoon. She rushes to the window, pressing her trembling palms flat against the cold glass. It is a brutal truth. Just when you think you have found a safe corner, life reminds you the storm is already inside the house. Audrey presses her pale hand to the window pane, her wide eyes watching Silvio on the vast lawn below. The deep grey ocean broods violently behind him as he slowly raises a heavy rifle to his shoulder. A loud crack splits the salt air, shattering a flying clay disc. He does not even blink, his dark focus cleanly tracking the next target. The unnerving, dead stillness of his broad shoulders between every shot makes her stomach turn over. Every pull of his trigger echoes through the silent estate like a violent end to her old life. Just this morning, she was holding white flowers in a bright church. Now, she wears a heavy mafia ring. Her past is entirely erased in smoke. The deepest life lessons come from how rapidly our reality can shatter, proving we must learn to quickly adapt or be entirely swallowed by the stormy sea. Let us look at this piece by piece. Today, you and I are going to unpack a dark story where the past act must burn so the future can finally breathe. The heavy echo of gunfire still rings sharply in Audrey's ears, each crack tearing through the safe life she knew just hours ago. She stands frozen like a statue, pressing her bare palm against the freezing glass. Audrey Palmer walked into that bright church absolutely certain of her mild destiny. But now, Audrey Gallo stares out at an unrecognizable, violent world, terrified of what this newly hardened version of herself might be forced to do. After a scalding shower violently washes away her shattered fairy tale, she finds a sleek black dress waiting on the bed. It is a garment promising undeniable power. Sometimes, the only way to discover who you truly are is to completely lose the person you were supposed to be. Look closely at this frame with me. The camera lingers on Audrey. She no longer resembles the weeping woman who fled a shattered wedding. Instead, she rises like a sovereign born from the cinders. A cold smirk graces her lips. She gathers the mud-soaked layers of her white gown, stepping into the damp night. Down below waits in the bruised shadows, a portrait of underworld mastery. His rifle rests beside a glass of amber whiskey. He watches the restless ocean, but his focus shifts as the fire catches her silhouette. Without a tremor, she offers that spoiled symbol of fake romance to the flames. The white silk turns to ash in seconds. The hard truth is simple. You have to watch your old life burn entirely to the ground before you can clearly see the path forward. The flames violently devour the white silk, casting brutal orange light across her face. Audrey does not even blink as the glowing ashes drift upward into the black sky. For 2 suffocating years, she folded herself into a silent box, playing the obedient partner because a coward named Max Gordon found her weakness manageable. The fire eats the final thread of that massive lie. You can physically see the tension melting off her rigid spine. She lets the blistering heat wash over her skin, feeling painfully alive. From the cold shadows, Silvio leans forward, his voice a dangerous velvet murmur slipping through the crackling fire. He tells her she looks like absolute poetry burning alive. He has been studying this glorious rebirth. Never shrink your wild spirit just to fit comfortably inside someone else's fragile world. Silvio measures her frame with the cold precision of a predator. He studies the sharp lines of her black dress, captivated by the absolute emptiness of fear in her dark eyes. He gives a slow, heavy nod. In the quiet theater of his mind, he marvels at how a terrified bride morphed into this terrifying force of nature. He watches her over the rim of his whiskey glass as she marches closer. The roaring fire throws wild shadows across her pale face. She stops a breath away, locking onto his stare with total certainty. The silence stretches out, choked with unspoken violence. But she lets it burn. Then she makes her final stand. She tells him the naive girl is dead, and she is fully committed to this dark syndicate bond. No man will ever make her feel small again. You must stand your ground, even when staring directly into the eyes of a ruthless boss. A wicked, razor-sharp smirk breaks across Silvio's stoic face. He slowly raises his heavy glass in a silent toast, delivering a cold, undeniable truth. Weak women do not survive long in his bleeding world. Before the gravity of his words can settle, a massive security guard steps out of the gloom with bitter news. Max Gordon is pacing at the front iron gates, throwing a desperate tantrum alongside 5 armed thugs. Silvio does not break his intense, magnetic gaze with Audrey. Stick with me for a second, because the air shifts right here. He takes a deliberate sip of his amber drink, totally untouched by the sudden threat. He casually orders his men to drag Max into the front garden, refusing to let that filth inside. He slings his rifle over his shoulder. Real power never panics when a ghost from the past shows up barking. It simply arms up and waits. Audrey watches his broad shoulders melt into the darkness, the massive fire roaring like a beast behind her. She takes one deep, anchoring breath, lifts her chin, and marches straight into her very first syndicate conflict. Out in the sprawling front garden, the tension is thick enough to choke on. Silvio strolls down the stone steps, his rifle resting easily on his shoulder, completely indifferent to the 5 armed men circling Max. Max stands in the dirt, dripping with cold sweat, trying to project strength while his knees visibly shake. Silvio pauses under the yellow security lights. He looks down at the trembling man with absolute disgust, mocking his blind audacity to show up here. Max stammers wildly, throwing his hands up in a pathetic attempt to play the wounded victim. Fake confidence will inevitably crumble to dust the second it comes face to face with true, lethal power. Sweating under the harsh security lights, Max tries to weave a desperate lie. He claims Audrey is suffering a total mental breakdown. He even warns Silvio that a feared crime boss surely does not want messy emotional baggage ruining his reputation. He actually demands they hand her over quietly. Silvio responds with a terrifying, ice-cold smile that reaches his dead eyes. He verbally obliterates Max right there on the crushed gravel. He points out the tragic nature of a man chasing a woman who sprinted away from his own altar. He tells Max that Audrey is not broken at all. She finally woke up to see the cowardly shell of a man he truly is. Then Silvio drops the final nail in the coffin. He lowers his voice to a lethal whisper as he brings up the cheating. No matter how deep you bury them, your darkest secrets will always find a quiet way to catch up to you. You and I have seen desperate people cling to control, but this is staggering delusion. Any rational man would fold, but Max tries to negotiate his way out of the grave. He pulls a pathetic trump card, smugly claiming he has Audrey's passport locked in his car. On paper, he argues, she is still his legal bride. Sylph stares at him with crushing pity. He slowly lowers his heavy rifle to the stone floor. He asks if Max genuinely believes the underworld operates on filing cabinets. His crime family built the very blood-stained church they are standing near. For the Gallo bloodline, a wedding is sealed by blood, a priest, and a violent vow. Paper means absolutely nothing here. We often mistake a fragile piece of paper for power, but true authority is never written down. It is a heavy gravity you feel the second a real boss walks into the room. The heavy oak doors groan as they swing wide. Audrey steps into the biting night wearing a sharp black dress. She walks like she owns the cracked pavement beneath her feet. Shoulders pulled back, her sharp heels striking the stone like a ticking timer. She stops right beside Silvio, so close the freezing air crackles between them. Inside, her damaged heart is hammering a frantic rhythm, but outwardly, she is carved from pure, unforgiving ice. Max just stares at her, paralyzed like a deer caught on a dark highway. Audrey looks dead into his frantic eyes and calmly asks where his side piece went. Max scrambles, loudly claiming he made her, that without his expensive ring, she is a nobody. But remember this painful truth: never let a toxic soul convince you they wrote the story of your success. Your worth is always built by your own bruised hands. Silvio tenses, but she holds the reins. Audrey does not even blink. Her beautiful face remains absolute stone, but her tense shoulders drop a fraction, shedding 2 agonizing years of heavy lies onto the dirt. She looks at Max and agrees. She tells him he showed her plenty, especially the dirty secrets on her wedding day she was never supposed to find. The truth is, sometimes the absolute worst betrayals are exactly the painful wake-up call you need to finally open your blinded eyes. Max clenches his jaw, entirely out of leverage. Right at that exact second, Silver pulls a massive power move. Without a single warning, his arm wraps securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard side. Audrey feels the solid, dangerous warmth of the crime boss at her back. Standing there facing her toxic ex, she actually feels anchored in the storm. Silvio tilts her chin up, leaving her exactly one desperate heartbeat to realize what comes next. The camera pushes in. Let us look at this closely together. We all recognize a staged kiss, but this raw collision goes way beyond a simple act. Audrey tries to convince her racing mind it is just a trick to break Max, but when Silvio kisses her, slow, demanding, and absolutely certain, she entirely melts against his chest. Across the cold courtyard, Max is having a pathetic meltdown, screaming into the dark like a jealous child. When they break apart, the night air feels incredibly heavy. Silvio turns back to Max, his amused smirk completely dead. His voice drops into a flat, bone-chilling tone, laying down 2 final rules. Do not touch what is mine, and never come back here. Pay close attention to this. True power never has to shout to dominate a room. He gives Max 10 agonizing seconds to dissipate completely. Max mutters under his breath, turns, and walks out of her life forever. Let us examine this scene together. We watch Max and his fragile crew scatter into the crushing dark. For Audrey, 2 whole years of her life evaporate into the cold wind, leaving a hollow silence. Yet, her raw survival instinct ignites instantly. She pivots on her heel, throwing a lethal glare right at Silvio. Staring down an apex predator, she draws an absolute line in the concrete, warning him to never cross her boundaries again. There is a profound truth here. Never let a fleeting moment of vulnerability convince you to lower your hard-earned armor. Fleeing up the frozen marble stairs, she escapes his heavy gaze, pressing her trembling hands flat against the solid mahogany door. Her heart hammers violently against her ribs. Slowly, she reaches up to touch her own swollen lips, deeply terrified by the intoxicating venom of the payback she just witnessed. Stepping into the suffocating shadows of the master bedroom, Audrey feels untethered from her own sanity. She is forced to interrogate her biology. Is this frantic pulse the intoxicating rush of sudden revenge, or the lingering fire of Silvio claiming her lips? The 2 dangerous sensations bleed together perfectly. A soft knock breaks the heavy silence. A servant says the boss expects her for dinner, but she firmly refuses, anchoring her weight behind the locked door. We must remember this quiet lesson. Sometimes, choosing absolute isolation is the only method to protect your fractured peace. As the footsteps fade, she drifts toward an antique floor mirror, trembling as she traces her lower lip. She tries to blame the sheer adrenaline of her shattered reality. Then she sees it. Resting cleanly on the massive mattress is a meticulously staged, sheer black lace sleep set. The camera lingers on Audrey as she stares at the scandalous lace, a broken laugh escaping her lips. It is pure visual irony. Nothing says peaceful rest after a forced syndicate marriage, quite like a garment designed for possession. Yet, she slides it on, knowing her rigid dress is no longer an option. Life often forces us into suffocating corners, and sometimes you must wear the uncomfortable armor you are dealt just to survive. Morning breaks, hitting her like a physical blow. She blinks awake to a foreign ceiling, strange voices echoing below. Panic claws at her throat, wearing only that fragile lace. Her trembling hands open the heavy closet doors. Her breath vanishes. A massive, untouched wardrobe hangs in the shadows. Every single garment is pitch black and tailored to her exact measurements. The lens captures Audrey comprehending the sheer depth of Silvio's control. That sea of black fabric is no thoughtful gift. It is his silent method of marking territory. Accepting the rules of this tragedy, she slips into a sharp, tailored dress. Staring into the glass, the terrified civilian bride is gone. What stares back is a lethal, calculated mob wife. Never forget this truth. How you present yourself can completely rewrite the energy you bring to a battle. She descends the grand staircase, bracing her mind for Silvio. But the room is empty. Waiting at the table with champagne is Aldo, his older brother. He drags his cold eyes up and down her frame, treating her like a prize won in a bloody war. The disrespect burns, absolutely. But Audrey does not flinch. She simply pours her coffee, entirely unbothered by his toxic power play. The lighting shifts as Audrey measures the man sitting across from her, instantly diagnosing his fragile ego. She asks if he is Silvio's twin. Aldo flashes a sickening smirk, bragging he beat his brother into this world. By 3 minutes, Audrey takes a slow sip of her coffee. She coldly replies that she assumed the second-born was the bigger one. It is a surgical strike to his masculinity. His smile shatters. He leans in, asking if the Gallo name makes her feel dangerous. Audrey does not retreat a single inch. She sets her cup down, locks onto his pale eyes, and calmly states she was dangerous long before anyone knew her name. Always remember, true power is forged by your unbroken spirit, never a borrowed title. Aldo stares in deafening silence. His gaze is drowning in unhinged greed, completely ready to strike. The frame tightens on Aldo's face. He drops his voice into that insidious tone predators use to dismantle confidence, asking if she knows the details of their father's will. Audrey keeps her face a frozen mask. Aldo smiles as he spills the bitter truth. The old patriarch left the crime syndicate to whichever son manages to marry and produce an heir first. It is a sickening twist. Silvio did not rescue her out of romantic chivalry. She was a pawn, the fastest option to secure a bloody crown. Remember this lesson. If a sudden rescue looks exactly like a fairy tale, there is always a hidden price tag attached. Audrey swallows the crushing weight of betrayal and coldly claims they have a mutual agreement. Aldo simply smirks. He tells her if she is truly that smart, she bet figure out which brother will actually survive this family war. The unbearable tension shatters when an older, intensely commanding man strides into the room. He dismisses Aldo effortlessly, waving him away like a foolish intern. He introduces himself as Michael Caruso, the ghost, running the family from the shadows for 25 years. As they walk the long corridors, Michael drops an ominous warning. He tells her to watch her back around Aldo, labeling him a venomous snake. Audrey carefully locks that chilling detail into her mind. When they step into the main office, the atmosphere violently shifts. Silvio sits behind a massive desk radiating ruthless corporate energy. The street warlord is gone, replaced by the calculating architect of a dark empire. Listen to me on this. The most dangerous people in this world are the ones who know exactly when to switch their masks and fully adapt to the room. The camera frames Silvio as he lifts his eyes from the screen, dissecting her with a cold stare, and orders her to sit. Audrey just stands there, a statue of defiance. He looks devastatingly handsome, but his eyes are completely walled off, emotionally bankrupt. She refuses to play the quiet, tragic wife. Cutting through the silence, she brings up the bitter truth of the will. She looks the ruthless boss dead in the eye, stating her rescue was a desperate grab for power. Silvio does not blink or apologize. He flatly admits that if she had not fallen into his lap, he would have married anyone else. He reduces her to a mere convenience. That word cuts to the absolute bone. But hear me out on this. Being someone's convenience might be where your story starts, but it is entirely up to you to adapt, fight back, and become utterly irreplaceable. Welcome to the midnight hour. Let's step into the cold halls of power together, shall we? Audrey sits perfectly still, hands neatly folded, burying the agonizing dread twisting in her chest. Then why am I here? She asks, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. Silvio slowly sets his pen down. A sharp click echoes off the walls like a judge's gavel. His dark eyes lock onto hers with terrifying weight. He reveals that tomorrow her family is coming to dinner. She must sell the flawless lie that this marriage was her voluntary choice. He steps close, forcing her to look up. If she fails, Max will unleash the police, freezing his empire. The heartbreaking truth here. Sometimes the cruelest chains are forged from cold strategy, and you must willingly play the devil's game just to survive the night. The illusion shatters quietly. Audrey stares at the man she thought was her shield, realizing he is just another monster guarding his empire. Silvio does not flinch at her boiling anger. "You are my business," he tells her. There is zero warmth in his tone, just raw, unbreakable ownership. Then comes the devastating blow that stops her heart dead. That secret, desperate debt her father had taken on. Silvio quietly bought it. He owns her bloodline now. "How did you know?" she whispers, her body trembling. Silvio merely smiles a chilling, hollow curve of his lips as he gently lifts her chin. The touch is soft, but the silent threat roars. Fail tomorrow and her family falls into ruin. A grim lesson for the quiet hours. Never accept a blind favor from an apex predator, because counterfeit safety always costs you your soul. The air in the office grows heavy as the power dynamic shifts. Silvio looms over her, a terrifying man of calculated authority. He coldly clarifies that he does not make threats, he simply manages his property. He orders her to wear the mask of a fierce syndicate empress tomorrow, forbidding her from playing the weeping victim. By next week, he swears, Max will be stripped of weapons. Just like that, the tragic moment breaks. By 8 in the morning, the boss is gone, wrapped in a sharp suit, commanding the city through his phone. He leaves her alone to orchestrate a high-stakes dinner in his dark shadow. You and I can take a profound lesson from this agonizing dance. Confidence is the absolute strongest armor you can forge. Walk into the roaring fire, acting like you own the flames, and the world must bow. Refuse to be the victim of your own story. Left behind in that gilded cage, Audrey feels the crushing weight of old mob money. The massive estate is a chilling labyrinth of quiet luxury. She watches 5 staff members glide past, alongside 2 guards carved from stone. She is trapped with no phone, no identity, and 0 money. Her real life is suspended across the city. The despair could have swallowed her, but she swallows her tears instead. Gathering the fractured pieces of her pride, she marches straight to the towering guard at the heavy iron gates. She declares, her voice trembling yet fiercely unyielding, that Silvio is wrong if he thinks she will quietly accept this house arrest. There is a beautiful, tragic truth in her defiance. You must learn to stand your ground even when your hands are completely empty. Your unbroken mindset is the only true freedom they can never steal. Let us unpack this devastating scene together. The guard stood like an immovable stone wall, forcing Audrey back into the suffocating grip of that mansion. She stormed into the kitchen, hitting a wall of untamed, chaotic energy. Aldo was there, bare-chested and scarred, casually carving an apple with a gleaming blade. He carried a dangerous, feral grace. When she snapped at him for lurking, he only smirked, amused to watch the captive bride flinch. But inside that bitter tension, Audrey found a sudden spark of hope. She desperately needed a way out, and this unpredictable wildcard obeyed no master. She locked onto his dead eyes and boldly demanded a ride. The brutal lesson here is simple. When the heavy front door is deadbolted shut, you must find the raw courage to pry open a shattered side window. Always seek the unexpected escape. The camera captures Aldo sweeping his predatory gaze over her. He chews an apple slice before letting out a hollow laugh. Why would he risk his brother's lethal fury for her? Audrey pushed back, brilliantly taunting him for being safely obedient to the boss. Instantly, his amusement vanished and his eyes went dead. He stated with freezing clarity that they were not allies. Audrey felt the sharp sting of rejection, yet masked it perfectly. Turning on her heel, she hot-tossed a bitter command, telling him to put a shirt on unless he was terrified of catching feelings. A rough, genuine laugh echoed as she walked away. An hour later, while she sat drowning in despair in the garden, a harsh car horn suddenly shattered the silence. Never let cold rejection extinguish your inner fire. When a door slams in your face, walk away with your head held high and your dignity completely intact. The camera lingers on Audrey, the low, predatory purr of a black Porsche cutting through the heavy silence. Aldo waits behind the wheel, cloaked in shadow. When she freezes, reminding him they are enemies, Aldo merely flashes a fractured smile. Tearing down his brother Silvio is his greatest joy, he whispers with toxic delight. At the iron gates, one freezing command from Aldo shatters the guard's resolve. The engine roars, tearing them onto the highway. Aldo mocks her over the howling wind, branding her a little bird fleeing a golden cage. Sometimes the hands that pull you from the wreckage do not care if you bleed. They are merely playing their own violent game. Take their hollow salvation anyway, because survival demands that you use their darkness to secure your freedom. The camera tightens on Audrey's face in the pale highway lights as her voice drops to ice. She is nobody's fragile pet, she warns him, and that marble palace was never her cage. She demands to retrieve her clothes. Aldo offers no argument. A slow, amused smirk curls his lips as haunting reflection of Silvio's own arrogance. Chaos is his oxygen. He crushes the gas pedal, and the Porsche launches forward violently. Audrey grips the handle with bone-white knuckles, praying for survival, while Aldo throws his head back in a wild laugh. The tires finally scream to a halt outside her old apartment. If they treat you like a helpless bird, you must bare your teeth before the cage door shuts. Silence is simply an invitation for them to keep you locked in the dark forever. Audrey scrambles into the night, desperate for sanctuary, but Aldo shadows her every step. She commands him to wait outside. He simply brushes past her, murmuring that he never chases ghosts, and steps right over the threshold. He prowls her humble living room like a predator, dragging a slow finger across her bookshelf. This claustrophobic little box was your actual cage all along. He taunts softly. As Audrey frantically packs, he closes his eyes and inhales deeply, whispering that the air here is intoxicatingly sweet. Stick with me here, because you and I both know the danger of this exact moment. Never let a toxic soul get comfortable in your safe space. Once they breathe your air and touch your past, tearing their dark shadow out of your home becomes an absolute nightmare. The camera captures the suffocating tension in the bedroom. Aldo blocks the exit, his frame erasing the safe distance between them. He leans down, his breath grazing her hair as his voice dips into a velvet whisper. The sweetness, he notes, is entirely her. Her heart batters violently, but Audrey forces her face into a mask of ice. She takes one sharp step backward and orders him to sit, drawing a strict line in the dust. Aldo locks onto her with pale blue eyes, letting a villainous smile surface before retreating like a satiated wolf. When her bag is packed, he mocks his little Cinderella returning to her cell. When a predator tests the edges of your comfort zone, you must build a wall of ice immediately. Surrendering even an inch of your ground is a fatal mistake. Out on the street, a rare smile graces Audrey's lips, but tragedy never rests. Two shadowed figures block their path. A brutal hand clamps over Audrey's wrist, the thug growling about a meeting. As she fights, Aldo sheds his playful persona and becomes a waking nightmare. His voice flatlines, commanding the man to drop her. Before the thug can pivot, Aldo shatters his jaw with a sickening crack. Two ruthless blows leave the man bleeding on the asphalt. The second goon reaches for a weapon, only to freeze as Aldo presses a gun barrel directly between his eyes. You and I must appreciate the dark irony of this life. Sometimes the demon tormenting your days is the only one ruthless enough to pull the trigger to protect you when true night falls. Aldo locks onto the man's terrified eyes with a chilling calm. He dictates the new reality: nobody touches a gallows, and Audrey wears the family name now. He leans closer, delivering the ultimate threat. Silvio might humor a few rules, Aldo whispers, but he possesses none. The thugs scramble into the shadows like beaten dogs. Minutes later, the Porsche tears down the black asphalt. Aldo steers lazily with one hand. His right hand rests on the console. Knuckles split wide open, oozing crimson from the sheer violence. Audrey is paralyzed by the sight of his torn flesh, but Aldo just offers a hollow smirk. Words fade into the wind, but la sudden violence leaves a lasting stain. A man can play the charming fool in the sunlight, but when blood finally spills, his true monster is fully exposed. Aldo flashes a bruised grin, softly asking if she is genuinely worried about his wounds. Audrey keeps her emotional armor bolted shut. She shoves a napkin toward him, muttering she only wants to spare the luxury leather from his mess. A gravelly laugh tears out of Aldo's throat. He uses his teeth to pull the paper tight across his split knuckles. Audrey then demands to know why he saved her if he wants his brother destroyed. The humor vanishes instantly. His jaw turns to granite as he admits he would rather hold her debt than watch Silvio break her. She fires back, swearing she will never be a pawn in their poisoned blood feud. Never blindly accept a savior in a broken world. Charity is nothing but a beautiful ghost story. Every bloody favor they offer will eventually demand a piece of your soul as payment. The Porsche glides past the gates, leaving Audrey in a fleeting moment of peace. But the second her boots strike the gravel, the air freezes. Silvio stands at the top of the stairs, a suffocating storm raging in his dark eyes. Her walk toward him is a tragic march to the gallows. Silvio's fingers clamp brutally around her arm. There is zero warmth here, only the freezing grip of absolute ownership. Staring straight through his grinning brother, Silvio growls that husband and wife require a private chat. Aldo, merely raises his blood-stained knuckles in mock surrender as the mahogany doors seal shut behind her, swallowing the light. Jealousy masked as protection is a death sentence for the spirit. When someone guards you like stolen terror, Trory, they are never fighting for love. They are demanding absolute dominance. The click of the study door echoes like a gunshot. Silvio is a coiled spring, a muscle ticking in his granite jaw. He invades her space, dropping to a lethal whisper to demand why she got into Aldo's car. Audrey retreats until her spine hits the freezing plaster, but her spirit refuses to shatter. Silvio slams his palms against the wall beside her head, physically caging her as he warns her not to push his mercy. She holds his furious gaze, reminding him that a marriage contract does not purchase her soul. She only fled because his guards turned the estate into a tomb. Silvio coldly claims he is keeping her breathing, not locking her away. Standing up to a force trying to break you is terrifying. But if you let a monster cage you against the wall today, they will construct a permanent prison around you tomorrow. Silvio lingers in the shadows, tracking the anxious rise and fall of Audrey's chest. He claims she is naive to the wolves outside his gates, but Audrey sees through his psychological chess match. She knows exactly where to slide the blade. She hurls his fragile pride back at him, swearing he only cares about projecting dominance and forcing an heir to his bloody throne. She promises she will never warm his bed. A chilling amusement shifts across Silvio's face. He leans in until his breath brushes her lips. Instead of a kiss, he delivers a surgical, emotional strike. He never wanted her anyway, he whispers. She simply isn't his type. When someone powerful goes out of their way to humiliate your spirit, it reveals their deepest secret. They are absolutely terrified of your unbending will. The oxygen in the study turns into lead. Silvio drags a calloused thumb down her cheek before dropping head heaviest anvil. She is nothing but a temporary bandage for a bleeding empire, he murmurs, promising that when he builds a true home, it will be with a woman he actually loves. It is a calculated blow designed to hollow out her chest. But Audrey is forged from harder steel. She swallows the burning sting, locking her features into a blank, unnerving calm. She simply nods, stating quietly she only needs her normal clothes to survive his charade. Silvio sweeps a freezing gaze down her body, commanding that cheap denim is forbidden under his roof. Never give the architect of your pain the privilege of watching you bleed. True power is found in the quiet refusal to shatter when someone deliberately strikes at your heart. Silvio Gallo, the brooding king of this nightmare, turns his back. His voice is a dead chill as he orders her to wear his chosen dress and play the obedient bride at 8 o'clock. Without a glance over his shoulder, he delivers one final demand: stay away from his brother. Audrey paints a defiant smile on her face, refusing to let a crack show until she is safely locked inside her bedroom. But the moment the door clicks shut, the stoic act shatters. She tears into her luggage in a blind fury, hurling documents and clothes onto the mattress. You and I both know the feeling of letting pure rage take the wheel when the walls close in. But chaotic anger never builds a solid escape route. She stands over the wreckage, her chest heaving, letting the bitter reality of the Gallo family sink into her bones. Audrey paces the shadowed bedroom, her steps striking the hardwood against the oppressive quiet. Her gaze locks onto the black dress Silvio left on the mattress, slashed high, engineered to parade her as his prize. A tragic smirk graces her lips. Not his type, she whispers, letting the insult spark a fire in her chest. In our darkest hours, pure spite is often the only gasoline a fractured soul needs to keep fighting. The cold house soon erupts into a frantic hive of rushing servants. Audrey descends the grand staircase in faded denim, a walking rebellion against a tyrant's rules. She pushes through the heavy kitchen into the keys of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary, where Giorgio, the arrogant head chef, guards his iron stove like a loyal soldier. The harsh kitchen lights illuminate Silvio's intimidating dinner menu. Audrey approaches Giorgio with a terrifying absolute calm, informing him the plans are changing. The chef balks, his shoulders tensing as he hides behind the strict demands of his boss. But Audrey holds her ground, commanding simple braised ribs and vegetables, desperate to offer her parents genuine warmth. You see, real hospitality is about offering a safe harbor to those we love, not a hollow display of violent wealth. Giorgio glares, warning her the meat requires 4 agonizing hours to cook. Audrey does not blink once. "Start the fire," she commands softly. He surrenders with a heavy sigh. She turns away, finally claiming a tiny sliver of territory in a brutal house built to break her spirit. The long shadows of the sitting room offer zero comfort. Audrey agonizes over the impossible lie she must feed her parents. How does a daughter explain marrying into an empire of blood? Michael, the stoic enforcer, steps silently from the hallway. He extends a brand new phone, explaining the boss wants her old life entirely disconnected. It is a suffocating leash, yet she slips the cold device into her pocket. Sometimes true survival means quietly accepting the heavy chains you cannot currently break. She attempts a hollow joke about calling old friends, but Michael turns to solid granite. Staring into the gathering night, he delivers a chilling truth. The entire underworld of Providence already knows her name, her past, and the exact vulnerability she brings to the brutal Gallo family. Michael speaks with the gravity of a death threat, warning that invisible eyes track her every move. Audrey searches his stoic face, asking if the crushing paranoia ever fades. The enforcer stares at the dying sunlight, murmuring a haunting reality. You only stop noticing the prison walls when you finally trust the man who built them. It is a profound lesson for anyone caught in the dark, but Audrey would not trust Silvio to hold a dying match. As the clock strikes 6, dread transforms into a physical ache. She leans her trembling hands against the oak dresser, fighting for breath. "I survived the altar," she whispers to the shadows. "I can survive the evening." Her eyes fall to the lifeless dress. Silvio demanded a garment designed to make her beautiful while entirely erasing her voice. A sharp knock shatters her dread. The housekeeper leaves a massive box on the bed. Audrey tears away the crimson paper, gasping as emerald green satin spills across the mattress. This gown is not clothing, it is a literal weapon, designed to command the room. Hidden within the folds is a heavy card. It orders her to rule the table like a queen, promising the color will ignite Silvio's rage flawlessly. It is signed with a single letter. A. Aldo. The twin is playing a lethal game, weaponizing her to sabotage the king. Audrey sits paralyzed, gripping the note. The fractured loyalty in this dark family just handed her a loaded gun. Sometimes the greatest tools for liberation come straight from your enemy's divided camp. The only question is who will pull the trigger first. She stands before the mirror, the silence heavy with agonizing questions. Was Aldo provoking his brother, or was this a twisted psychological game? Her mind drifts to the bitter struggle to maintain composure against Silvio. Her trembling fingers brush the rich satin. You and I can agree on one profound truth here. True courage is rarely the absence of fear. It is putting on the revenge dress while your heart hammers in your chest. She slips the gown on, and the glass offers 0 lies. The fit is flawless, a calculated strike by Aldo to orchestrate absolute ruin. She paints bold crimson across her lips and fastens Silvio's diamond earrings. If you must start a fire in the dark, you might as well pour gasoline on the flames. The woman's staring back is no longer a timid runaway. She does not look like a soul drowning in mafia debt. She looks like absolute ruin, and a tragic part of her deeply relishes it. Her heart hammers, but she draws a steady breath, tilts her chin, and steps forward. The sharp click of her heels against the cold marble echoes through the mansion. Down in the foyer, Aldo lounges against the wall. He tracks the rhythm of her approach before his dark eyes find her. His mocking smirk vanishes instantly. He scans her, paralyzed by the clinging emerald satin. A quiet curse slips from his parted lips. He whispers he knew the color would suit her, but never anticipated she would look like a beautiful, unforgivable crime. When we finally embrace our own raw power, even the people who tried to use us will stand completely paralyzed. Aldo closes the distance, his voice a mocking whisper. He reminds her his brother demanded an obedient bride. A dangerous gleam dances in his eyes, warning her she is now an instrument of devastation. Raising his glass to the tragic Cinderella, Audrey holds his gaze, refusing to show fear, and sweeps past him. Silvio sits at the head of the table, king of his dark empire. At the sound of the doors, he turns, every syllable dies in his throat. His hardened features lock down, bearing in the violent shock crashing through his mind. He slowly rises to his feet. Audrey walks directly toward him, commanding the agonizing quiet. Remember, silence is often the loudest weapon you can wield against a tyrant. Silvio does not blink once, consumed by the sight of her in that unforgiving dress. Silvio stares at the emerald silk, unable to look away. His knuckles bleach white against the mahogany, broadcasting the violent war within his mind. Audrey stands before him, refusing to shrink. When his rough voice reminds her, this was not the gown she took upstairs, she looks him dead in the eye and states she hated the other one. Aldo strolls in, choking back a laugh as he notes how the fabric matches her eyes. Silvio shoots his twin a look of absolute murder just as the doorbell shatters the tension. Notice how she uses her wardrobe as literal armor. It reveals a powerful truth we must all learn. The ultimate weapon against someone demanding total control is quiet, unshakable confidence. Silvio swallows his rage, pulls on a polite mask, and strides to the door. Silvio slams his palm against the small of her back. Through the satin, she feels the ruthless pressure of his fingers. He leans in close, his voice dropping into a velvet threat as he demands she smile. But Audrey refuses to break. She flashes a brilliant smile that belongs entirely to her, slipping from his grip just as the heavy doors swing open. Her father, Arthur, steps into the foyer. He is a humble man, but his sharp eyes immediately lock onto the armed guards in the shadows. This teaches us something profound. We must never underestimate a parent's fierce intuition when their child is in danger. Arthur senses the cold reality hiding behind the luxury, feeling the threat deep in his bones. As her mother cries out and rushes forward, Martha throws her arms around Audrey. Audrey breathes in the scent of home before her mother pulls back, eyes wide with terror. Martha whispers desperately, begging to know if these men hold her prisoner. Audrey insists she is free, but a mother always recognizes her child's lies. Then, Silvio flips a psychological switch that is terrifying to witness. He glides forward as the flawless host, greeting Arthur with respect and kissing Martha's hand. Moments ago, he was drowning in violent rage. Now, he plays the devoted family man to perfection. Pay close attention here. When someone seamlessly alters their personality to manipulate a room, we must never ignore it. That is not natural charm. It is the calculated warning sign of a predator hiding in plain sight. The dark masquerade continues. Silvio wraps a possessive arm around Audrey's waist, assuring her parents it is an honor to host them. Aldo steps from the shadows with a dangerous welcome. When Martha notes the twins' resemblance, Audrey coldly states they do not look alike to her at all. Aldo flashes a wicked smirk, while Silvio's fingers dig ruthlessly into Audrey's ribs. 10 agonizing minutes later, they sit down for dinner, but Arthur has zero interest in polite pleasantries. He stares Silvio dead in the eye, his voice like iron, demanding to know how this stranger married his daughter overnight. Here is a powerful lesson. A truly good person is blind to expensive marble floors and empty wealth. Their only genuine concern is protecting the people they love from the wolves at the door. Let us examine this tragic frame together. The camera pushes in slowly, bathing the room in heavy gloom. Silvio drops his hand onto Audrey's bare shoulder, claiming to Arthur that he finally found love at first sight. Arthur sits there, a man carved from pure grief. Then, the brother strikes. Aldo leans back, laughing cruelly that swapping grooms was just an act of efficiency, reminding everyone she already had the gown on. The ambient sound drops away. Silvio goes perfectly still. He stares at his twin with the crushing weight of a winter grave, stating Aldo treats romance like a clinical procedure. Here is a truth you and I must always remember. When toxic people try to burn your world down, maintaining an absolute, terrifying silence will forever be your most lethal defense. The dining room is choked by unspoken violence. Silvio swears her parents he would never abandon Audrey to a failure like Max. Desperate to soften the bleeding wound of this dinner, Martha forces a hollow laugh, rambling about Audrey hiding as a little girl. Aldo catches the dark light reflecting off Audrey's dress. He cruelly notes that this time, the girl is trapped in a fortress by a literal dragon, out of frame, beneath the linen. Silvio seizes Audrey's hand. His thumb grinds brutally into her palm as he murmurs that dragons never share their gold. We must remember this painful rule of endurance. Sometimes, you have to willingly play along with the monster just to survive. Audrey simply leans into his crushing grip, offering a sweet, heartbreaking smile. The camera holds steady on Audrey as she lays a devastating trap. Looking at her mother, she promises she is safe, specifically because her gown has such complicated clasps. In the shadows, Silvio's body turns to stone. The crushing pressure of his thumb stops dead. Audrey flawlessly delivers her lines, gushing about her new husband. Martha swallows the bitter lie whole, but Aldo lets out a sharp laugh, seeing the exact strings she is pulling. Audrey flashes a smile made of venom, complaining that fastening 20 clasps takes 15 minutes. Beside her, Silvio is quietly burning alive. Let this serve as a powerful life lesson. True dominance is in keeping your enemies completely charmed while you set their rulebook on fire. Arthur just watches the disaster unfold in total silence. Silvio swallows his rage, his voice tight as he suggests dessert. Soon after, the farewells begin. Audrey's painted smile is close to cracking. By the grand oak doors, her mother pulls her into a desperate embrace, begging her to visit tomorrow alone. The camera catches the tragedy in Audrey's eyes. She wants to scream that this mansion is just a beautiful nightmare, but the armed guards stand nearby like statues. She buries her agonizing fear and promises to call. Martha searches her daughter's face, hunting for the painful truth beneath the makeup. We have all lived this timeless life lesson. The people who truly love you will always see the deep cracks in your armor, no matter how flawless your performance is. Arthur stands paralyzed as the door clicks shut, sealing her in the dark. The front door latches with a sickening thud, and the house exhales a hollow breath. Audrey freezes in the dim light, her mother's frantic whispers echoing in her ears. She turns slowly, finding both brothers waiting like wolves. Aldo wears a twisted smirk, entertained by her survival tactics. But Silvio is a completely different storm. His eyes are pitch black, tracking the metal clasps down her spine with quiet violence. She lifts her chin, forcing a hollow joke about the dinner. Aldo chuckles from the shadows. Let us look at this crucial lesson together. Sometimes, the absolute bravest thing a broken person can do is recognize an unwinnable war and simply walk away. She mutters a quiet goodnight, slipping past the dangerous men before the room can catch fire. The camera follows Audrey as she bolts up the grand staircase, abandoning her polite grace. Aldo's laughter floats up from below, but Silvio's absolute silence wraps around her throat like a snare. She slams her bedroom door, her chest heaving. The gorgeous emerald gown is now a suffocating cage. She reaches back, frantically clawing at the cold metal clasps down her spine. Her trembling fingers slip uselessly. One stubborn hook refuses to yield. Just as she thinks she is safe, a heavy fist strikes the wood. The door swings open, framing Silvio in the dim light. His jacket is gone. His sleeves are rolled up, exposing the veins of a predator. Here is a terrifying life lesson we all must face. The real danger is never the shouting man. The true threat is the quiet one who no longer feels the need to speak. The bedroom instantly turns suffocating. Silvio stands across the rug, radiating a dark heat. The veins in his bare forearms pulse with contained fury. He catches her terrified gaze in the vanity mirror, and her stomach turns into cold dread. His eyes drop to her trapped hand, studying the unbroken line of metal clasps down her spine. Defeated by the fabric, she lets her arms fall. Silvio clicks the door shut with agonizing deliberation. He glides into her space, his gravelly voice noting she appears to need assistance. She shakes her head, but he reads her panic like shattered glass. He steps behind her, trapping her against the heavy wood. Let us remember this humbling life lesson. Life will always strip away our pride exactly when we need it most. We can lie to the world, but our trembling hands will always confess the unspoken truth. The tension stretches into an absolute eternity. For an agonizing moment, Silvio does not touch the silk. He simply stands behind her, watching the furious blush rise to her cheeks in the mirror. His low voice breaks the silence, accusing her of wearing his brother's color to test his limits. Audrey raises her chin, projecting a bravery that does not exist. Slowly, his large hand sweeps her hair over one bare shoulder. His rough knuckles graze the skin of her neck. She shivers violently, hating her body for its betrayal. A sharp snap echoes like a gunshot in the quiet room. He unhooks the top clasp, his hot breath grazing her ear as he mentions her parading with the enemy. This teaches us a haunting life lesson. Sometimes our deepest emotional scars come from the burning touch of the exact person we know we should run away from. There is a terrifying weight to the sharp click echoing in this bedroom. Silvio vibrates with quiet fury, enraged that she allowed his brother to stare at her all evening. But Audrey refuses the tragic role of the helpless victim. She catches his dark gaze in the mirror, reminding him he made it clear she was not his type. The untouchable crime boss freezes. The silence becomes a heavy, physical thing. She pushes the knife deeper, asking why touching her causes him such literal agony. He offers no defense. Instead, his fingertips merely ghost down the bare curve of her spine. It is a phantom graze, far more devastating than a violent grip. He leans in to whisper his truth. We see this painful reality so often in life. We always try our hardest to break the delicate things we are secretly terrified of holding on to. Let us unpack this psychological moment together. You and I, Silvio unhooks the final clasp. The emerald satin pools at her bare feet like ruined armor. Audrey gasps, crossing her arms over her chest to shield her soul. He does not step back. Instead, his eyes trace an agonizing path from her bare shoulder to her trembling hands. Her legs can barely support the gravity of his presence. He leans in, his sharp jaw brushing her temple, and delivers a cold whisper designed to haunt her. He tells her to sleep well and dream of everything he chose not to do. Then he walks out, leaving her shivering in the void. The lesson here is profound. True power is never about violently seizing what you desire. Real strength is having the control to just walk away, letting the empty space do the destruction. The heavy door clicks shut, echoing like a prison gate. Audrey collapses onto the mattress, gasping for air as if she had been drowning. She retreats under the blankets, desperately trying to sleep off the lingering poison of this untouchable boss. But the cinematic silence of the mansion offers zero mercy. She tosses and turns in the pitch black, yet all she can see is a sharp, cruel angle of his face. She remembers the slow slide of the dress and the terrifying reality of being at his mercy. And then, that final whisper commanding her to dream of his restraint. We must learn this harsh truth. Sometimes, the most destructive thing a person can do to you is absolutely nothing at all. It hollows you out, leaving you swinging wildly at a ghost you cannot touch. She lies there, burning in the dark, outmaneuvered. The camera points down at the massive bed. Audrey stares blankly at the ceiling, her mind spiraling down a dangerous rabbit hole. She tries to focus elsewhere, desperate to scrub the memory of Silvio from her skin. She whispers to the empty room that she is in control, hoping to beat this man at his own psychological game. But the attempt pulls her deeper into his trap. The memory crashes over her. She vividly recalls the exact moment his calloused hand simply stopped moving down her spine. His terrifying restraint leaves her hollowed out by her own unmet expectations. She sits up, abruptly, gasping for air and furious at her weakness. Let this serve as a clear warning. You can never fight fire with fire when the devil already owns the matchbox. She is dancing perfectly to his cruel tune, and that realization makes her hate him more. Let us look closely at this frame together. You and I. The bedroom is bathed in cold morning light, casting shadows across the tangled silk sheets. Audrey sits up, her chest heaving as a terrifying truth takes root. A dark, unspoken part of her actually prayed Silvio would walk back through that heavy oak door. We pan to her trembling hands opening the wardrobe. Gone are the faded jeans, her usual rebellion against this gilded cage. Instead, she pulls out a sleek, tailored black dress. The fatal intention is entirely clear. The truth is, the moment you alter your daily armor just to catch the eyes of a monster, the war is already lost. She stares into the vanity mirror, desperately pretending she is immune to his crushing gravity. But the glass reflects a woman surrendering to the dark. The camera pushes in tight on her face as she applies a dark lipstick. It is a brutal portrait of self-reflection. Why paint herself for a ruthless syndicate leader who plays games with her sanity? She slowly descends the grand marble staircase, bracing her nerves to face Silvio. But the vast dining room is empty of his shadow. Only Michael stands there, while Aldo lounges in his chair like a coiled viper. When Michael mentions the boss departed before dawn for 3 days, Audrey forces a polite nod, yet her stomach drops into an icy void. The agonizing disappointment washes over her. If you ever tumble into the dark with a predator, your survival depends on mastering your poker face. Aldo smirks over his black coffee. He reads her shattered expectations instantly. She is completely exposed. Audrey tries to shrug off the icy blow, but a man like Aldo feeds on misery. The camera lingers on his cruel smirk, mocking the fresh heartbreak etched across her pale features. Humiliated, she snaps, ordering a car to take her far from this golden prison to see her mother. Michael, the disciplined ghost of the estate, nods and prepares the dark sedan she desperately needs to flee the suffocating emptiness Silvio left behind. The tires barely stop before Martha pulls her daughter inside, locking the door as if the devil is right behind them. A mother's intuition is always a terrifyingly accurate compass. Martha slams an iron kettle onto the stove, her weathered hands trembling. She senses the underworld rot clinging to her daughter's soul, and sheer panic fills the room. They sit across from each other at the scuffed kitchen table. The silence amplifies the weight of Martha's piercing stare. She leans in, demanding to know if this crime boss is treating her properly. Instantly, Audrey's mind betrays her. The frame flashes to a vivid memory, his large hands gripping her waist, the dangerous tension burning in his study. She fumbles her words, stammering that the arrangement is complicated, insisting she is not a prisoner. But Martha's eyes remain hard, cutting through the fragile defense. Here is a fundamental truth of our world. You might lie to your enemies, or even the syndicate, but you can never deceive the woman who gave you life. Martha clearly sees the invisible chains pulling tight. She knows exactly how deeply this dark man is already buried inside her daughter's mind. The tension reaches a breaking point as the quiet desperation finally shatters. Martha pushes harder, demanding to know what this dangerous Don truly means to her daughter. Audrey freezes, 100 safe lies resting on the tip of her tongue. She could call him a shield or a simple transaction in the shadows. Instead, the camera catches her shaky exhale as she surrenders the heaviest truth of all. She loves him. The small kitchen goes dead silent. The very air stops moving. Martha crumbles into the chair, taking Audrey by the hands, pleading with her not to let this violent world destroy her. We see this tragedy so often. Keeping a massive, unspoken truth buried inside your chest is exactly like holding a lit match. Eventually, the flame burns down and the fire will consume you. The car tires crunch against the gravel of the massive estate, but the deep shadows frame the scene differently tonight. Without Silvio's terrifying presence, the house is nothing but an echoing tomb. God help her, but she actually misses the man. Desperate to catch her breath, she wanders down to the private beach, letting the cold salt wind bite at her pale face. But peace never lasts in this tragic underworld. Heavy footsteps drag through the sand, and Aldo steps into the pale moonlight. Gone is his sharp mobster armor, draped in soft white linen. The ocean breeze makes him look remarkably like a fallen angel. Listen closely to the lesson hidden in the midnight wind. The men who wear the brightest halos in the daylight are usually the exact ones pulling you into the darkest depths after the sun finally goes down. She absolutely refuses to let him see her tremble. The camera catches the pure ice in Audrey's gaze as she asks if he always stalks his brother's accidental brides. Aldo offers a slow smirk, sinking into the cold sand beside her, and then she crosses the invisible line. She asks about their mother. In a devastating heartbeat, the playboy vanishes. The pale light highlights Aldo's hollow eyes. His voice drops to a dead whisper, stating she died bringing them into the world. He claims they never cared. It is a practiced lie meant to numb the agonizing reality. This is a human tragedy we all face. The people who parade around wearing untouchable armor are always the ones bleeding from the oldest wounds. This massive criminal empire was never built on raw power. It was built entirely on a foundation of unspoken grief. The pieces of the broken puzzle finally clicked together in Audrey's mind. Silvio's suffocating need for control is not about dominance. 35 years ago, losing his mother taught a frightened boy that the second your grip slips, the people you love fade into the cold earth. Her terrifying husband is nothing but a walking fortress of unhealed sorrow. But then the midnight wind shifts. Aldo, the brother who thrives on poison, slowly reaches out. The camera focuses on his trembling hand as he softly brushes a stray strand of hair from Audrey's cheek. There are no cynical jokes now. There are no twisted smiles. It is just the crushing weight of two lost souls recognizing each other in the dark. Trauma might build the most impenetrable walls around a bleeding heart, but sometimes one quiet moment of genuine tenderness is enough to shatter them completely. Refuses to give up a single inch of ground. She holds her posture rigid, staring directly into the dark depths of Aldo's eyes, voicing her suspicion that he has despised her from the start. Aldo attempts to slide his careless mask back in place. He weakly waves away 35 years of trauma, murmuring that hate is an awfully heavy burden. But Audrey does not waver under the moonlight. She holds the gaze of this dangerous man and swears her absolute loyalty to Silvio. For one terrifying second, the trickster vanishes. Aldo stares at her with a dead calm, whispering a dark warning to tread carefully. We have to understand the tragic cycle of violence. Loyalty is a beautiful trait, but blindly trusting a world glued together by blood and lies is exactly how a gentle soul ends up burning to ash. The grand dining room feels like a marble mausoleum tonight. Let us step into this suffocating silence together, you and I, and examine the architecture of isolation. Silvio is a ghost, his empty chair radiating an ominous chill. Aldo appears hollowed out, aimlessly pushing his food around, unable to meet Audrey's gaze. The camera frames Audrey as she feels the walls of this golden cage closing tightly around her throat. She turns to Michael, the stoic butler, and declares she is done rotting away between expensive silk sheets. Michael gently offers the standard illusions of freedom, like afternoon rides with armed guards. But listen to the cold truth of the human condition. Having all the wealth in the universe is just another form of absolute poverty if your soul has no real purpose to wake up for. Audrey shatters the heavy quiet, refusing to be treated like a fragile porcelain doll. She rejects the hollow luxuries, demanding real work where she does not have to beg a ghost for permission to exist. Suddenly, the venomous Aldo bleeds back into the scene. He laughs a biting sound, mocking her like a naive child playing make-believe while the king is away. Audrey does not shrink from his toxic edge. The tension spikes as she fires right back across the mahogany table, warning him that he is playing a dangerous game. To stop the room from erupting into war, Michael quietly steps in from the shadows, explaining the crime family's legitimate operations. Here is the raw truth of the human spirit. Fighting for your own independence will always be infinitely better than fading away inside a comfortable golden cage. Let us look closely at this tragic stage, you and I. The lighting is cold, casting shadows over Audrey as she refuses to fade like a covered trophy. Michael cautiously offers a polished cage, managing high society gallus. Aldo leans back, a wicked grin spreading across his face, knowing she will turn those elegant tables into a battlefield. Audrey anchors her weight, claiming the heavy mantle of special projects liaison. Then, Michael makes a fatal error. He whispers that they must wait for the boss to give his blessing. Her eyes instantly turn to absolute flint. She will not let an absent husband pull her strings. There is a brutal truth here. If you spend your brief life waiting for someone else to grant you permission, you will simply turn to ash at the starting line. The camera pushes in on Audrey as she delivers a masterclass in quiet, psychological defiance. To ask Silvio is to beg for a collar, she states coldly, but walking through those doors tomorrow makes her presence an undeniable fact. Aldo leans closer, intoxicated by the approaching chaos. He murmurs that stubborn facts are exactly what ignite family wars. When dawn breaks, Audrey stands before the Gallo Empire headquarters. It is not some rusted underworld basement. It is a towering monolith of cold glass and sharp steel. The blinding perfection of this corporate machine makes the violent decay underneath infinitely more terrifying. The darkest traps in this life are never built from heavy iron bars. They are perfectly polished, completely invisible glass doors. The sharp click of her heels against the cold marble lobby echoes like a ticking clock. A suffocating wave of silent terror washes over the room. Employees scramble into the shadows, paralyzed by the weight of the boss wife walking among them. Aldo flashes a shark-like grin, tempting to steer her toward the events division, teasing that she is built for controlled disasters. But Michael cuts through the noise to reveal the grim reality. This pristine corporate role is just another velvet cage designed to keep her visible yet blind to the Syndicate's dark operations. Silvio isolates her because his fractured soul cannot trust a single living person. You can build a fortress of glass and hire an army of guards, but a mind poisoned by paranoia will never find a moment of peace. As they approach the steel elevators, the atmosphere thickens into something suffocating, though Aldo casually waves off an anxious butler, stepping forward to escort her into the metal box himself. Audrey tightens her jaw, fighting to mask the frantic beating of her pulse. She pretends she is unaffected by being trapped with the Syndicate-esque, most unpredictable demon. The doors slide shut, and the oxygen is instantly sucked from the air. She builds a fragile wall of ice, stating coldly that this is strictly a professional visit. Aldo does not blink. He leans against the mirrored wall, a dark smirk radiating menacing heat as the quiet grows agonizing. You can run to the highest penthouse in the city, but your deepest demons will always ride the elevator right up with you. Let us step back and examine this gilded cage together, you and I. Over the next 3 days, Audrey discovers this corporate machine is agonizingly hollow. The terrified staff tiptoes around her, treating her like a volatile explosive. Desperate to claw back some genuine meaning, she throws herself into organizing the Harbor Foundation Gala, fighting to inject warmth into an event built for cold elites. As she stares down at the lifeless black tablecloths, a familiar, crushing weight settles deep into her ribs. It is the exact same suffocating prison she felt when Silvio controlled her every breath back at the estate. Playing it perfectly safe and bowing to every rigid rule might build a comfortable existence, but it will inevitably bleed every ounce of fire right out of your soul. Audrey stepped into that sterile boardroom and completely shattered their grand illusion. She looked into the eyes of the executives, calling their fragile plans exactly what they were: utterly useless. A suffocating silence dropped over the table, like the breathless pause right before a tragic storm. But she held her ground. If you want their money, she warned, you had to make them feel the bleeding weight of those struggling families. The temperature in the room physically shifted. Michael watched from the shadows, while Aldo failed to hide his hungry intrigue. You and I have seen this dynamic play out before. When you finally recognize your own terrifying worth, you stop waiting for an invitation. You pull up a chair, speak the brutal truth, and force the room to adjust to your presence. Aldo trailed her into the hall with a cynical smirk. He murmured that playing games with powerful men was a deadly risk. Audrey did not even blink. She met his cold stare, reminding him that he thrived on that very same danger. Later, she returned to the desolate estate, a deep exhaustion pulling at her bones. But as the car halted, the air suddenly thickened. Silvio was back. He was not hiding in some gilded office. He stood against the harsh ocean wind, his sleeves rolled back, gripping a heavy shotgun. With terrifying precision, he shattered clay targets against the gray sky, radiating raw dominance. No matter how high you climb, never let comfort soften your edges. To survive the monsters of this world, you must always remain a dangerous force yourself. Audrey held her breath as the blast of the shotgun echoed across the churning water, the violent sound settling deep into her bones. She forced her trembling hands to steady, adjusting her lipstick in the tinted glass before stepping out. Her heart hammered against her ribs, yet she walked forward with her head high. Silvio did not bother to turn around. He methodically reloaded the heavy chamber, destroyed another target, and let the crushing silence stretch out. Only then did he slowly pivot, turning those cold eyes onto her. His intense gaze swept over her frame, instantly burning all the oxygen from the air. True power never raises its voice or rushes to speak. Real authority lives in the quiet patience of holding your ground and forcing the world to come to you. Audrey stepped closer, breathing in the sharp tang of gunpowder and dark cologne. Silvio tested her, his low voice demanding to know what corporate title she had claimed. She refused to waver. Meeting his piercing gaze, she declared her role in special projects, making it clear this was no empty vanity position. She braced her shoulders, expecting a storm of wrath for her defiance. Instead, the boss simply raised his weapon to the sky and blew another clay target into falling dust. When she questioned his unnatural calm, a dark smirk touched his lips. He confessed he preferred a woman driven by actual fire. People of true influence will only respect you when you carve out your own space with bare hands, rather than begging for scraps in the shadows. Stick with me, because this shift in power is mesmerizing. Silvio let his gaze drag across her dark dress, murmuring that he admired a woman with ruthless purpose, especially one carrying his name. The words hung in the freezing air, thick with dangerous heat. Before Audrey could catch her breath, Is ordered her to take the heavy shotgun. She admitted she had never fired a weapon. He whispered that he already knew. Stepping directly behind her, he wrapped his arms around hers to brace the cold steel, pressing his chest against her spine. The air sparked with overwhelming tension. He did not posture or shout to assert his dominance. Absolute confidence acts as a silent gravity, drawing the entire world into your orbit without forcing a single thing. Silvio leaned close, his voice a dark rumble against her ear as he told her to stay loose. The second his hand settled on her waist, Audrey's focus completely shattered. Electricity shot through her ribs like a physical strike. He commanded her to breathe, pressing his palm flat against her stomach through the thin fabric. She fought an agonizing battle just to remain upright. He told her to watch the target, but her mind was drowning in the intoxicating heat of his touch. Never let the overwhelming pull of a fleeting moment blind you to the real objective ahead. His fingers curled over hers, turning the air impossibly heavy. When she finally pulled the trigger, the violent recoil nearly tore her backward. But he was already there, holding her perfectly steady. The clay disc exploded in the sky, dissolving into dust. Audrey spun around breathless, a wild smile breaking across her face. Silvio did not even glance at the shattered target. His piercing blue eyes were locked entirely on her. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as he praised her, quietly laying a heavy claim on her soul. He pressed a slow, burning kiss against her neck, stealing the last of her strength. Yet, in a jarring shift, the cold mob boss instantly returned. He took the weapon, stepped away, and calmly stated he had calls to make, acting as if he had not just ruined her sanity. You must always guard your composure, especially when life sweeps the ground from under your feet. He cast one final mocking look at her dress and vanished into the cold afternoon. The wind whips past Audrey as she watches his dark figure stalk toward the mansion. The phantom heat of his palm still sears her skin, yet his absence is suffocating. In this chilling quiet, a brutal realization crashes into her ribs. For 3 agonizing days, she had not been plotting an escape. She had been starving for his return. She steps into a dining room drowning in old wealth, where flickering candlelight casts ghost-like shadows, but the sprawling table sits empty. Both Silvio and his brother are gone. You and I know the fatal trap of anticipation. Never let unchecked expectations become your anchor, because people will always rewrite the script. She should feel pure relief in the silence. Instead, a tragic, hollow ache carves its way deep into her chest. The camera lingers on the painful emptiness of the dining room. Michael catches the devastating drop of her shoulders. With a stiff bow, the butler announces the brothers have left for the city. Audrey's blood turns to ice, the sheer arrogance of it. Silvio returns just long enough to brand her with a kiss, then abandons her again. Her trembling fingers grip the silver fork, fighting the fiery irritation in her throat. She needs a harsh awakening. She bound herself to a phantom for a contract, not a tragic romance. Listen closely to the warning buried in her fury. Never allow yourself to romanticize a cold transaction, or you will be the only one left bleeding. Realizing she is staring at his empty chair like a desperate bride, a suffocating wave of shame crushes her lungs. The memory of her ex bleeds into her thoughts, bringing only a heavy flush of humiliation. Max kept her small for his fragile ego. Healing was easy once that illusion cracked. But Silvio is a vastly darker predator. He has awakened a terrifying hunger inside her, making her crave a devotion she has no right to demand. Disgusted by her trembling weakness, she shoves her plate away and flees. By dawn, the lighting shifts to harsh, defiant clarity. Snatching his heavy black card, she trades her gilded cage for the chaotic city. It is a simple truth to live by. The only way to reclaim your lost power is to force your own momentum instead of waiting in the shadows. Flanked by armed guards, she refuses to ask where her husband is. Escaping the estate feels like pure, soaring victory. The camera frames Audrey stepping out like a sheer force of nature, dark lenses masking her eyes. If Silvio expects a flawless Mafia bride, he will bleed fortunes for the costume. By midday, boutiques part for her like royalty. When that heavy black card catches the light, the city bows. There she finds her ultimate weapon, a blood cherry dress radiating dangerous dripping wealth. It does not whisper for an audience. It violently demands submission. Staring down her reflection, she makes a permanent choice. You must always define your own identity before a cruel world assigns one to you. Black is Silvio and his suffocating control. Green is his toxic brother, but that fierce, undeniable red, that is entirely hers. She buys the dress and a petty bag, driving the heavy point home. It is past midnight. The estate air is thick with unspoken tension. Audrey pushes through the towering doors laden with designer armor. High on the sprawling staircase, half swallowed by shadow, Aldo and Silvio watch her every move. Aldo throws a biting joke about retail therapy, a defense mechanism born from their toxic world. But Audrey is a statue of pure ice. Without a single blink, she fires back that she simply discovered her husband's credit card has absolutely no limit. Silvio steps from the dark, his voice a bone-chilling rumble. The limit exists, he murmurs. She just lacked the nerve to find it. The lesson hanging in the air is quiet but heavy. Sometimes you have to walk into a room and completely command the oxygen, because unshakable confidence is the one currency wealth can never buy. Upstairs, the hot bathwater offers fragile comfort in a life spiraling out of control. Audrey drapes the cherry dress across the vanity, sinking into the foam to scrub away the grime of this dark reality. But here, the quiet is always a lie. The heavy door swings open, and there he stands, Silvio. His jacket is gone, sleeves rolled up like a brutal man who just buried his sins. His dark eyes drag across the scattered bags and crimson silk before locking fiercely onto her. Her pulse hammers violently against her ribs. Yet she remains completely still, wearing a flawless mask of calm. This is the truest lesson of survival. When the world kicks your door down and catches you vulnerable, never let them see your hands shake. Hold your ground and make them believe you orchestrated the chaos all along. He rests against the doorframe, letting her name slip out slow and deliberate, Audrey Gallo. She turns, snapping that he needs to learn to knock. He does not flinch. He just murmurs that she should answer, so he never has to worry. She wants to scream, but the air in the room is impossibly heavy. She asks if vanishing all day is some dark mafia tradition. A cold smirk touches his lips as he asks if burning cash is hers. Then the playfulness dies. Be ready by 7. Tonight is their first gala appearance. Let us look at this together. Real power is never found in those who make the loudest noise. True power is keeping your heart rate completely steady and holding eye contact when the stakes push you to the absolute edge. Audrey lifts her chin, proudly declaring she picked her own dress. Silvio does not miss a beat. He murmurs that he already knows, a fact that crawls right under her skin. Slowly, he gestures toward a velvet box on the vanity. Diamonds. He bought them without ever seeing the red silk she planned to wear. She stares at him, demanding to know how he could choose jewels for an unseen gown. Silvio holds her gaze, his eyes dark and empty. He says he knows exactly what the color red needs. When she pushes him for an answer, he drops one heavy word into the silence. Restrained, then, he steps away, leaving her alone with a pounding heart. Here is a simple lesson to remember. You do not need to see the whole canvas to know what is missing. Sometimes the quietest restraint speaks the loudest. 7 o'clock strikes, and the dark shadows of the estate part just for her. Audrey emerges in cherry red fabric, looking less like a wife and more like a beautifully lethal weapon. The diamonds sit cold against her skin, catching the dim light. She takes a slow breath and starts down the wide staircase. Aldo waits at the bottom. The man, with endless jokes, goes completely mute. That silence feels impossibly heavy, but Audrey only looks at Silvius. Plus, he stands frozen, his dark gaze tracking every inch of that dress, the bright ice, the deep crimson on her lips. It is a moment of pure cinema. Stick with me, because there is a powerful lesson here. When you finally stop hiding and step into your true power, your mere presence is heavy enough to silence the absolute loudest room. Down by the stairs, the air is suffocating. Silvio murmurs, her dress is flawless. Audrey quietly replies he chose well too. A dangerous pull hums between them, but Michael interrupts. The motorcade is ready. Then he drops a heavy weight on the night. Max Gordon, the cruel ex who destroyed her, is on the gala list. Audrey freezes, her knuckles turning white against Silvio's dark suit. Aldo mutters that things will turn violent, yet Silvio stands like a statue. He covers her trembling hand with his own and whispers two cold words. Let it. We all have to face the ghosts of our past. You cannot control when old pain resurfaces to test you. But when you build your life on true loyalty, you can look that bitter history straight in the eye and finally bury it for good. The second the heavy car door opens, flashbulbs strike them like a violent storm. It is a chaotic ocean of screaming reporters, barely held back by the brute muscle of security. When Silvio steps onto the carpet, every lens pivots. Smoothly, with dangerous grace, his large hand slides flat against Audrey's bare spine. It is a deeply territorial move, a silent claim made while the whole city watches. Audrey lifts her chin, letting her diamonds catch the harsh light as her red dress trails like liquid fire. She tries to pretend this is just a hollow business arrangement, but think about what happens when you wear heavy armor for too long. You can hide behind a mask and say you are only surviving, but the fierce energy you project will eventually become the exact life you live. Through the blinding flashes, Silvio leans down and presses his mouth to the bare curve of her neck. The press line erupts into chaos. It is a calculated, devastating move to prove they are an unbreakable front. He pulls back just enough to whisper against her skin, telling her to smile. She mutters she already is. His fingers slowly trace her spine, sending a visible tremor through her body. He whispers, "Now you are." Suddenly, a reporter screams a brutal question. Did Silvio marry Max Gordon's runaway bride the exact day she left him at the altar? The red carpet falls dead quiet. It is a vicious strike. Listen to me. People will always try to drag you backward by throwing your messy past in your face. True victory is holding your sharpest smile and never letting them see you bleed. Let us watch this unfold together, frame by frame. Harsh flashbulbs cut through the dark, illuminating the panic rising in Audrey's chest. But Silvio does not flinch. He pulls her against his suit, becoming an impenetrable wall of shadow and stone. With absolute winter in his veins, he stares the hungry reporter dead in the eye. He declares his wife simply walked away from a man unworthy of her grace. The crowd falls silent as he proclaims, the city will remember her for greatness, not some cheap scandal. Audrey stands paralyzed, trembling, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of being elevated instead of crushed. A true partner never flees when your ugly history bleeds into the light. They stand like a fortress and force the world to respect your name. The camera sweeps inside the ballroom, capturing a pure masterclass in raw power. Audrey did not merely salvage this broken charity gala. She breathed life back into its dying lungs. The soulless corporate art is gone, replaced by the gritty, bruised portraits of the harbor workers. The city elites, mesmerized by this injection of raw humanity, quietly write massive checks under the dim chandeliers. By the mahogany bar, Silvio remains entirely frozen. His dark eyes track his wife as she commands the space with the lethal grace of a woman who was underestimated for far too long. When the world tries to force you into a suffocating box, do not politely step out of it. You must tear that miserable cage to pieces and use the splintered wood to build yourself a blazing new stage. As the midnight shadows lengthen, Audrey moves slowly toward the crime boss. He studies her with absolute stillness, absorbing the crimson silk and the untouchable aura radiating from her bones. The slow jazz fades. Silvio approaches the microphone. The heavy air braces for another empty speech about family honor. Instead, he abandons the script entirely. He looks past the glittering elite, finds Audrey standing quietly in the dark, and delivers the painful truth. He confesses the night was meant to be a hollow illusion, but his wife changed the very rules of their existence. She took a lifeless performance and filled it with bleeding purpose. You do not need a flawless mask to demand respect. Strip away the polite lies, show them a completely authentic heart, and the right people will follow. You and I must let the heavy weight of this frame sink in. Silvio leans into the microphone. He murmurs that he gave her a room of powerful monsters, but she gave them a reason to feel human. The ballroom erupts in deafening applause. Yet, Audrey is completely deaf to the noise. Her eyes are locked onto Silvio. The ruthless glare of a kingpin has melted into raw, unguarded devotion, violently dismantling her armor. She is a master at surviving cruelty, but genuine respect leaves her paralyzed. From the darkest corner, Aldo's black eyes track the shifting tide. Then, a bitter shadow drops over her fragile shoulder. Her cruel ex, Max, has found her. The moment you finally claim your peace, the ghosts of your past will claw their way back to test your strength. Never let them burn your empire. The camera pushes slowly into the suffocating tension. Audrey pivots on her heel, keeping the trembling Max strictly in her line of sight. He stares at the crimson silk and heavy diamonds resting against her skin, physically choking on his own acidic jealousy. He spits out a cruel sneer, mocking her for upgrading from a simple secretary to playing dress-up on a violent man's leash. Audrey does not even blink. She stares directly through his rotting ego, calmly reminding him she was merely a secretary when she single-handedly held his shattered life together. From the velvet shadows, Silvio materializes. The towering boss slides a heavy, protective hand onto the bare curve of her lower back, a terrifying, absolute claim. Sometimes, standing tall and letting your bitter enemies watch you thrive is the most devastating vengeance of all. Silvio's low, gravelly voice drops between them like a massive block of ice. He locks eyes with Max, coldly stating that Audrey was never a fragile woman. With surgical precision, he completely dismantles the rival's pride. He notes that Max possessed a partner capable of bringing an entire room to its bleeding knees, yet chose to treat her as manageable. Silvio's terrifying calmness makes it clear this fatal error reveals everything about the shivering coward standing before them and nothing about Audrey's worth. Max stands frozen, his jaw unhinged, drowning in his own inadequacy. Delivering one final, deadly warning to quietly enjoy the catering, Silvio gently turns his wife back toward the music. Never let a broken soul define your worth simply because their trembling hands are too weak to hold your true potential. The mournful notes of a saxophone bleed over the crowd. Audrey tilts her head, whispering that he did not need to fight her battles. Silvio never breaks his slow, predatory stride. He simply glances down, his face a perfect shadow, and murmurs that he already knows. Those two quiet words send a burning jolt directly through her ribs. The grand gala spirals into a massive triumph. As Silvio vanishes into the corridors to deal with the cartels, Audrey remains in the glittering light. Then, the poison enters the frame. Aldo, the twisted brother, slithers close with a glass of amber whiskey and a wicked, hollow smile. He mocks her brutal nature, praising her for breaking a man so easily. True influence is not about flashing gold. It is about reaching into the dark chest and making someone feel an undeniable, beating pulse. Audrey refuses to let her painted smile crack for even a fraction of a second. She is painfully aware of the hungry lenses tracking every movement. Leaning into the toxic air between them, she whispers that she assumed he had an appetite for cruel things. The serpent hesitates, A dark storm of intrigue clouds his eyes. He murmurs that he strongly prefers raw honesty, and tonight she is serving both in spades. It is a terrifying compliment from a lethal man, but a snake always strikes. Aldo steps into her personal space, his cold thumb casually dragging across the exposed skin of her waist where the heavy silk dips. It is a vicious, calculated power play. You and I must learn from her next breath. Hold your absolute composure when toxic monsters test your boundaries. Never hand your bitter enemies the sick satisfaction of watching you bleed. Audrey's tone drops to a whisper, carrying the chill of a drawn blade. Without breaking her radiant smile, she warns Aldo never to touch her again. He attempts a hollow laugh, but she cuts through the manipulation. She states he is only using her to test his brother Des' iron grip. With devastating precision, she declares her absolute allegiance, proving she stands fiercely beside Silvio. Aldo's arrogant mask shatters at the sight of true devotion. But here is the agonizing, irreversible tragedy of the frame. Across the sea of bodies, Silvio's dark eyes lock onto the scene. He only sees his brother's hand resting intimately on his wife's waist. The fatal misunderstanding is born. A painful truth of life is that managing the illusion of loyalty is often just as critical as harboring the actual truth. The camera cuts to the flickering lights of the concrete staff exit. Silvio hunts his brother down, cornering him against the cold wall with a terrifying, absolute zero energy. He commands Aldo to keep his hands off his bride. Aldo merely tilts his head, a sick smirk spreading as he openly admits his dark obsession with ruining whatever belongs to the king. But the boss is stripped of all mercy tonight. Silvio's voice scrapes the bottom of the register, ordering him to never look at her, never speak her name, and ensure his miserable shadow never touches her path. Again, the menace in Aldo's eyes flares. He taunts his older brother, asking what makes this particular pawn so utterly special. Toxic individuals will always desperately try to drag your most genuine, delicate connections down into the twisted mud of their own dark manipulations. Aldo practically vibrates with the chaotic poison he is injecting into the family. He barks a hollow laugh, claiming Audrey is merely a legal condition to keep the throne out of his greedy hands. He even dares to suggest the new bride might prefer a wilder companion. Silvio absorbs the insult with the lethal stillness of a waiting grave. He steps closer, his voice bleeding into a deadly whisper as he reclaims his wife's honor. You must build walls of iron against toxic family, or their venom will consume you. Aldo tries to brush the tension away, but Silvio does the truly unthinkable. The icy boss drops his armor entirely. He quietly, painfully admits that he actually cares for her soul. That bleeding, honest confession is vastly more terrifying than a loaded gun. For the very first time, Aldo's vicious smile completely evaporates into the dark. The camera traps us in the suffocating interior of the black sedan. The air is thick enough to slice with a knife. Silvio stares at the rain-slicked streets, completely shutting her out. Hours ago, he was a perfect shield, but the second the heavy car doors locked, his soul turned to frosted glass. Audrey tries to swallow the tension, but the memory of Aldo's touch burns like acid. She violently snaps the quiet in half, demanding the truth. Silvio stares straight ahead, flatly stating he has nothing useful to say. She fires back that such a petty excuse never stopped a stubborn man before. A hardened muscle jumps furiously in Silvio's rigid jaw before he unleashes a bitter accusation. He mutters that she certainly seemed to handle his brother just fine. The suffocating jealousies inside that dark car is deafening. True tragedy begins the very second communication dies. Picture this scene with me. the air in the car thick enough to choke on. Audrey refuses to back down. She states she ordered his twisted brother to never touch her again. Silvio strikes back, muttering that she delivered that strict order with a beautiful smile. The absolute nerve. Audrey fires back, reminding him they were in a room crawling with reporters. Did he expect her to slap his brother and ruin the family reputation? Silvio finally looks at her, his eyes drowning in dark jealousy. He says he just wanted Aldo to know better. Audrey snaps, pointing out that the snake did know better, which is exactly why he pushed the boundary. Here is a simple life lesson. Never let someone else project their blind insecurities onto your perfectly logical decisions. The rest of the drive is dead silent, and Audrey is left sitting in the shadows, fuming. The car stops at the dimly lit estate. Silvio steps out first, effortlessly playing the flawless husband. He offers his hand because the driver is watching. In this unforgiving world, the illusion of unity is absolutely everything. But the second those massive front doors close, he drops her hand like it is made of fire. He throws out a cold goodnight and marches to his room without a single backward glance. Audrey is left standing alone in the grand foyer. The diamonds around her neck feel like a collar of ice. He hyped her up to the city, only to freeze her out in private. Here is a simple life lesson. You can only push a person into the cold for so long before they finally snap. Audrey is done playing the quiet runaway bride. She is sick of controlling men dictating how she breathes, and the ultimate payback is brewing. Audrey refuses to stand there while he hides his dangerous jealousy behind a wall of silence. With her pulse hammering, she lets her anger burn hotter than her fear. She marches straight down the hallway to his heavy door. That red dress is radiating the chaotic heat of the gala they just survived. She knocks hard. For an agonizing second, there is only dead silence. The simple life lesson here is that sometimes facing your fears head-on is the only way to pull the truth into the light. Then, the handle clicks. Silvio stands there. His white shirt is unbuttoned at the throat, sleeves rolled up to reveal the brutal scars from his violent past. His face is a blank slate. You cannot read this mafia boss at all, and the raw tension flooding the narrow space between them is insane. Stick with me, this is where the game changes. That empty stare snaps her back to reality. No yelling, just Silvio watching her like a hawk. Audrey tilts her chin up, refusing to let his silence make her small. She demands to know his problem. He casually leans against the frame, totally relaxed, and innocently asks what she means. That fake ignorance almost pushes her over the edge. She steps directly into his space and orders him to drop the act. Here is the lesson. You and I must never let someone gaslight us into doubting our reality. Her voice drops low and fierce. She warns him he does not get to play the loving partner in public, kiss her neck for the cameras, and then treat her like a stranger in the dark. This confrontation is pure drama, and she is holding her ground. A flicker of emotion betrayed her facade, vanishing instantly into the shadows. Audrey despised herself for caring. Silvio dropped his gaze to her lips, then back to her eyes with that freezing stare he used in the interrogation room. He asked if that was what truly bothered her. The humiliation hit so violently she wrapped herself in fury just to survive. She snapped back, saying she was sick of being treated like a wife only when it suited his agenda. The moment she dropped that word, the air turned suffocating. It is a quiet truth that angry words often reveal our deepest vulnerabilities. Silvio straightened up. His grip was unyielding as he grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his dark stare. He repeated the word wife, his voice dripping with terrifying possession. She realized her mistake far too late. That word hung between them like a ticking explosive. He released her chin, but his touch left her skin burning. Furious with her own slip, she tried to escape, telling him there was nothing left to say. But Silvio moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned killer. His fingers locked around her wrist, yanking her inside before slamming the heavy door shut. She spun around, eyes blazing, prepared for war. Then his voice drops to a lethal growl as he demanded to know what was happening between her and his brother Aldo. Suddenly, the evening made perfect sense. Aldo touching her waist, Silvio glaring from the dark corners. Here is a simple lesson. Jealousy strips away our most carefully constructed masks. This was never about strict mafia codes. The untouchable boss was simply drowning in his own agonizing jealousy. Let us step into this heavy silence together. The tension is suffocating. Audrey refuses to back down, forcing her voice to stay steady. She looks this dangerous man in the eye and swears nothing is going on with his brother. But Silvio steps closer, his cold eyes darkening. He growls that he saw Aldo touch her. Audrey fires right back, reminding him she pushed the man away because she knows her place here. Then Silvio leans in, trapping her with a devastating question. He asks if her loyalty belongs to their contract or to him. It shows us that genuine trust cannot be written on paper, it must be earned in the dark. She tries to keep her composure, but he grips her waist, yanking her red dress flush against his chest, whispering that tonight the answer matters. Audrey clutches his shirt, knuckles white just to keep standing. She is done playing the victim. Her voice cracks as she tells him he has no right to play the jealous husband. He cannot abandon her, treat her like property, and punish her just because his brother tested the waters. Silvio stares at her hands, the last thread of his restraint snapping. He wraps an arm around her back and crushes his mouth against hers before she can take another breath. It is a desperate collision of two souls fighting for control. She gasps into the kiss, and he pins her against the door. It shows that our loudest conflicts often mask the things we are terrified to ask for. Her hands slide up his chest, feeling his heavy heartbeat, and all that fiery resentment melts away into the shadows. He presses deeper, his kiss turning ruthless, shattering every rational thought. Audrey surrenders. Her fingers dig in as his hand slides down her bare back, landing precisely on the spot his brother dared to touch. This is not just passion, it is a fierce reclamation. He drags his lips down her jaw, lingering where he marked her for the cameras. That was calculated, but this is pure obsession. The stoic boss has unraveled. She breathes his name, betraying how much she aches for him. There is a quiet lesson here. You cannot outrun your own truth forever, no matter how thick the walls you build. Silvio pulls back, his eyes burning in the dark. His voice is a rough whisper as he reminds her she chose to come to his door. Audrey just stares back, holding him captive by his ruined collar. Picture the raw physics of this moment. His grip tightens against her skin. Audrey knows she should walk away, but her pride fights a losing battle against pure instinct. She resents this man for seeing right through her armor, yet she violently yanks him back. Silvio lets out a stunned groan, his mouth crashing down on hers as he lifts her off the floor. Shadows and red silk blur together as he drops her onto the edge of the heavy desk. He stands trapped between her knees, chest heaving, his shirt ruined by the chaos. This brings a stark reality into focus. When you decide to own your choices, you have to leap completely. Hesitation only makes the fall hurt worse. She reaches for him, and his iron control shatters forever. The long game is officially over. The tension in this dimly lit room is heavy enough to break glass. Silvio abandons his cold strategy, going for that red silk dress like a man starving in the dark. Audrey completely surrenders, her fingers twisting into his hair as he trails burning kisses across her shoulder. That dress was her shield, but tonight it is collateral damage. He slides a rough hand up her thigh, and for one agonizing second, the ruthless boss hesitates. He is caught in his own rigid rules. Audrey is done waiting. She grabs his wrist and pulls his hand higher, breaking his final defense. He freezes before plunging them both into a wild oblivion. The truth is simple. Sometimes you must stop overthinking every single move. Let go of the illusion of control and allow yourself to feel something genuinely real. Audrey always believed that falling for a man meant sacrificing her sharp edge. Yet tonight, she uncovers the truest version of herself. Silvio scoops her off the desk and carries her to the bed, leaving that red silk on the floor like a forgotten memory. She is done hiding behind excuses. Silvio lays her down, his jaw tight as he fights a brutal war to remain gentle. Looking into his dark eyes, the ironclad marriage contract burns away. What remains is the raw truth of between two broken people. Hours later, she wakes up wrapped in warmth, his calloused fingers softly brushing her hair. He watches her without his usual demands. This brings a quiet realization. True love does not ask for a flawless performance. It simply values who you are when the noisy world goes silent. The camera lingers on the heavy curtains as morning light bleeds through, painting the ruined sheets in pale gold. Silvio lies there, radiating the coiled energy of a predator at rest. His icy blue eyes map the soft contours of Audrey's face, his rough hand tracing her jaw. When he murmurs a greeting, the gravel in his voice makes her jolt. We watch the panic flare, a frantic flush of heat rising to her cheeks. She parts her lips to build the familiar walls of her pride, but he leans in, drinking her defiance in a slow kiss. He catches her waist, pinning her breathless laughter under his lethal, dark smile. There is a quieted wisdom in this frame. Sometimes the truest salvation comes when we finally stop fighting. Instead of rushing to build barricades, we must simply take a breath and let ourselves be seen by the one beside us. Watch the exact moment the axis of power shatters. Silvio leans in, the shadows carving his face, and confesses in a bruised whisper that she drives him utterly mad. Audrey catches that rare vulnerability and flips the entire script. She shoves the massive, terrifying crime lord flat against the mattress and climbs over him. For months, he ruled their false marriage with an iron grip, but those days are entirely buried. She brushes her mouth against his, whispering a merciless truth. In this room, the crown belongs to her. Silvio throws his head back, a dark, rumbling laugh tearing from his throat as his large hands anchor to her hips. Yielding to her is his greatest triumph. Real confidence never requires you to rule with terror. True strength is knowing your absolute worth and stepping fearlessly into the fire of an equal partnership. The lens pulls back to frame the suffocating silence of the estate. For one fragile second, the notorious kingpin tastes pure peace. No gunfire in the distance, just the warm rhythm of Audrey breathing in the dark. She asks why his tyrannical father obsessed over a marriage clause in the family will. Not a single muscle in Silvio's face moves. His voice hollows out, revealing that the old man never possessed a heart. The patriarch only saw a blood-stained empire, breeding sons to die as disposable pawns. It is a brutal portrait of unchecked ambition. The architects who construct the most magnificent kingdoms are usually bankrupt of all humanity. You cannot mortar a dynasty with compassion. Audrey searches his rigid jaw and finally sees the tragic reality. This feared monster is just a ruined boy. crushed beneath generational trauma, bleeding out with no idea how to stop the flow. The shadows in the room seem to thicken as the tragedy unravels. Silvio confesses that his father never wanted a sovereign, only a chained dog burdened by a wife and child. When Audrey whispers the name of his brother, a man consumed by endless chaotic rage, Silvio just offers a broken smile. Because his brother could never destroy their father, he directed all his hellfire at the closest target. The camera pushes in as Silvio unearths his darkest ghost. His voice cracks. His mother died the very day he drew his first breath. No one ever called him a murderer, but they made sure he never felt innocent. The quiet poison of unspoken blame will rot a human soul far faster than any bullet. Audrey stares at his beautiful, ruined face, realizing the invincible underworld king is nothing more than a lost child, still carrying Spee, his mother's coffin. Look closely at the twisted architecture of this family. They crowned a boy with a criminal empire before he ever learned to simply be alive. Audrey maps out the horrific mechanics of their vendetta. The older brother believed Silvio stole the throne, while Silvio believed he stole their mother's life. A defensive smirk pulls at Silvio's lips as he whispers that she makes his agony sound clinical. But Audrey holds his gaze, unwavering. The wound is clean, she tells him, but people just bleed from unexpected places. It is a profound, cinematic truth. A broken person will always lash out blindly until someone is brave enough to touch the root of the infection. Silvio's breath catches. She has stepped into the pitch-black vault of his mind and refused to turn away. For a master manipulator, her brutal, unvarnished honesty shatters him completely. Let the camera linger here, because the emotional gravity of the room has just shifted. In the heavy midnight silence, Silvio strips away the last of his armor. He looks down at Audrey, his eyes bare, and tells her he wants to marry her again. No forged documents, no blood-stained contracts, no ghosts haunting the aisles. He presses a fiercely tender kiss to her trembling knuckles, vowing to make the world witness that she is his undisputed choice. Audrey is utterly paralyzed, pinned down by the sheer weight of his devotion. She finally exhales her greatest fear. Just days ago, she was nothing but a pawn. Why her, and why tonight? We must pause to recognize the tragic beauty of this moment. The most profound miracles in our chaotic lives only ever manifest in the exact fraction of a second when we drop our masks and surrender our true hearts. Audrey holds her breath, bracing her shoulders for the inevitable betrayal, waiting for the knife to twist. But Silvio simply leans closer, cutting through the shadows with devastating honesty. His voice vibrates in the dark like a low thunder. He tells her that she wandered into his hellish world trembling with fear, yet she looked at a monster and saw a man crying out for rescue. She stood defiant against a king who only knew absolute submission. She bypassed the violence, stared directly into his rotting wounds, and never dared to call him weak. His destiny is no longer anchored to a frozen, dead empire. It is tethered entirely to her pulse. Carry this truth closely with you. Genuine love is never the pursuit of a flawless saint. It is finding the one person who runs their fingers over your darkest, ugliest scars and stubbornly refuses to leave. A montage of 3 months passing. The suffocating, gothic gloom of the estate slowly begins to fracture, letting the golden light in. The mechanical routines of a crime family dissolve into something deeply intimate. Breakfast is delayed by 10 minutes, then 30. The visual storytelling is brilliant here. Terrified maids suddenly learn to knock twice. Stone-faced guards find the ceiling fascinating whenever Audrey emerges from the boss's study with ruined lipstick. Even the bitter brother sits at the endless mahogany table, watching Silvio hover over his wife like a protective shadow. With a dry, biting smirk, he announces to the silent room that everyone knows exactly why the king is sleeping in. It is a beautifully crafted reminder. You can build walls of iron and ice, but you can never truly conceal the radiant, blinding fire of genuine happiness. The right-hand man pours black coffee with the absolute stillness of a phantom, his survival rooted in ignoring the shifting dynamics. Across the polished table, Audrey buries her burning cheeks behind her porcelain cup. Yet, beneath the heavy oak, hidden from the camera's eye, the terrifying boss is tracing circles into her palm, anchoring her with a devastating, tender touch. Beyond the mansion gates, Audrey is transforming into a force of nature. Within the sprawling corporate glass of the Harbor Group, nervous whispers have faded into genuine reverence. Crisis managers flock to her desk, watching her navigate venomous high society wives with lethal grace. We see this happen constantly. The universe hands you a crown that feels impossibly heavy, but if you stand tall and refuse to take it off, that crushing fear will slowly forge itself into unshakable power. Notice how the director frames Audrey's evolution. It is a masterful study in the anatomy of power. She realizes that true sovereignty never needs to scream. It simply redesigns the chessboard. Stripping the foundation of its elite vanity, she pulls up chairs at battered tables, sitting eye to eye with exhausted nurses and desperate mothers. She is quietly building a fortress of radical empathy. In stark contrast, Silvio, the architect of underworld terror, willingly lays down his weapons. At velvet-draped galas, the ruthless kingpin shrinks himself just to proudly amplify his wife's victories. When she strides into his smoke-filled office carrying a new proposal, the fire in her eyes is blinding. It perfectly illustrates a critical lesson. Absolute influence is never stolen by screaming demands from the mountaintop. It is quietly earned by kneeling down to listen to the broken voices at the very bottom. Look closely at the framing here, because this is a breathtaking masterclass in exhuming generational rot. Audrey slides a document across the mahogany desk. The bold ink reads the Lucia Gallo Women's Care Fund, using his murdered mother's ghost to finance emergency clinics. The camera catches Silvio reading the name, his spine snapping rigidly straight. The silence in the office becomes thick and unbearable, suffocated by the phantom weight of a violently stolen childhood. Audrey steps into his space, demanding that his mother's memory finally breathe life instead of lingering as a blood-stained monument. Silvio's knuckles turned white against the paper as he whispers, utterly shattered, that he needed a warning. But the lesson is etched in stone. The most profound healing demands that we stop running, turn round, and stare directly into the terrifying shadows we have spent decades trying to escape. Audrey locks eyes with the terrifying mob boss, refusing to flinch. She understands the brutal mechanics of his panic, whispering that any warning would have given him time to strike a match and burn the paper. She leans down, pressing a profoundly tender kiss to his forehead, begging him to let his mother's ghost plant a garden in their desolate wasteland. Then comes the devastating cinematic climax. The untouchable kingpin physically shatters. He drags her palm against his mouth, surrendering as his fortress collapses. Days later, Audrey stands on the sunlit terrace, the crashing ocean matching the immense gravity of her love. She designs a wedding that began as survival, now reborn as holy devotion. The tragedy leaves us with this final thought. The thickest, most terrifying armor in the world is usually just hiding a terribly fragile heart, desperately waiting for someone brave enough to pull it off. The cinematic calm of the terrace shatters the moment Aldo steps into the frame. For the first time, his hands are entirely empty. No signature whiskey glass, no defensive smirk, just a dangerous, suffocating stillness. The atmosphere grows heavy with ghosts as he asks a haunting question. Was there ever a timeline where she chose him over his brother? Refusing the cheap comfort of a polite lie, Audrey delivers a surgically precise emotional strike. She admits she might have if he had desired her more than his obsessive need to destroy Silvio. The camera lingers on Aldo as he gives a slow nod, absorbing the devastating truth that his toxic rivalry poisoned his only chance at love. Her honesty acts as a clean, merciful blade. It teaches us a stark lesson. True connection requires a foundation of mutual hope, not the hollow wreckage of a bitter, unending vendetta. Framed against the stark, turbulent water, Audrey refuses to dilute the harsh reality of their tragedy. She acknowledges that Aldo saw her quiet terror back when the rest of their dark world remained entirely blind, yet she draws a fascinating thematic boundary. Silvio allowed her to reach into his violent soul and alter his nature, just as she allowed him to rewrite hers. Aldo scoffs, crossing his arms to mask his bleeding pride, calling such a dynamic exhausting. Audrey simply gazes into the horizon, declaring the emotional cost entirely justified. This highlights the true architecture of genuine devotion. It demands more than passive observation. It requires the raw courage to evolve together. Aldo's facade finally cracks as he whispers his lifelong trauma of always arriving second. Audrey lets the tragic moment breathe, knowing pity would only rebuild his cynical armor. Audrey holds his gaze, her expression unyielding. She delivers a piercing psychological critique. She demands he stop treating every room like a desperate, unwinnable race for affection. In a heartbreaking flash of vulnerability, Aldo suddenly looks like an exhausted runner who sprinted miles past a forgotten finish line. The camera watches him smooth his slacks, quickly rushing to reconstruct his shattered emotional armor. He warns her that such profound insights might cause the world to mistake her for a merciful savior. Audrey responds with a dark smirk, noting that true insiders would never make that naive assumption. As Aldo retreats toward the grand estate, a powerful observation lingers in the air. Establishing an ironclad boundary is often the only way to force a broken individual to carry their own psychological weight, rather than crushing you beneath it. Turning toward the churning black water, Audrey is framed entirely by the biting wind. Devoid of anger, she validates that Aldo always managed to pierce her theatrical facade. Yet, she drops a heavy anchor right into his chest. Silvio offered her total surrender. He allowed her to dismantle his violent world, while she permitted him to reshape her core. Aldo exhales a defensive sigh, his shoulders tense as he dismisses such vulnerability as exhausting. Audrey simply affirms the agonizing cost is beautiful. Staring into the abyss, Aldo whispers his trauma, an entire lifetime spent languishing in second place. Though her empathy flares, Audrey maintains her stoic posture. She understands a profound principle. Denying someone cheap pity and letting them sit in the freezing reality of their own choices is often the ultimate, necessary form of honesty. Let us take a closer look at this flashback together, rewinding the clock to 6 days before the wedding. The syndicate's sprawling estate is vibrating with frantic, nervous energy. We see chaotic dress fittings and tangled guest lists that test the patience of hardened enforcers. Yet, the director's lens zeroes in on Audrey, entirely isolated from the noise. She awakens to a profound, heavy shift deep within her bones. Bathed in the stark morning light, she sits paralyzed on the edge of the mattress, intuiting a life-altering truth before any confirmation. Reaching for a hidden box amidst the madness, she takes the test. This sequence beautifully illustrates a universal truth you and I both know. The most monumental transformations ignore our curated schedules. They crash into our messy realities, forcing us to abandon our plans and rise to the occasion. Visually, this scene is a masterpiece of quiet, suffocating tension. Audrey stands in the harsh bathroom light, staring at two faint lines that carry the weight of a criminal empire. Pressing a trembling hand to her stomach, she is torn between terror and fierce devotion. 2 floors below, the camera finds Silvio studying blueprints, attempting to overwrite his family's bloody legacy. Audrey bypasses the guards, thrusting open his oak doors. A single glance at her pale expression prompts Silvio to instantly dismiss his enforcer. The door clicks, sealing them in silence. Without a word, she places the plastic test upon the dark mahogany desk. The psychological framing here is brilliant. When destiny delivers an impossible mountain, you do not waste breath explaining it. You simply place it on the table and prepare to climb it together. The camera pushes in on the lethal boss as he stares blindly at the desk. The thematic weight of the moment lands like a physical strike. All color drains from Silvio's face. He sits paralyzed, suffocating beneath the dark ghosts of his own violent upbringing. In his ruthless world, a child is merely a fragile target destined to be erased. Audrey closes the distance, gripping his trembling hands. She fiercely declares that they are breaking the generational curse. Silvio chokes out a desperate vow to protect her, defaulting to his mafia instincts. Audrey rejects this framing. Protection is merely a tactical operation. She demands that he learn how to unconditionally love. His tragic confession that love is a foreign language underscores the core lesson. True bravery requires facing absolute terror, feeling your knees shake, and stepping forward anyway. In a stunning version of genre tropes, the untouchable king of the underworld drops down to his knees. Burying his face deep in her hands, Silvio takes his first genuine breath in decades. His vision of the future no longer ends in a shallow grave. Audrey simply holds him, acting as his psychological anchor. The narrative then cuts sharply to the wedding morning. Standing before a mirror, Audrey anticipates her usual rising panic, but the dread has vanished previously. A white dress symbolized a prison break, a frantic calculation of escape routes. Today, she is radically grounded, learning that Aldo is brooding by the shore. Now she gathers the heavy fabric of her gown and marches into the biting wind. This reveals a beautiful definition of personal agency. True power is not dominating a room. It is standing amidst the ashes of your past trauma and consciously choosing to finally stay. Catching Michael's anxious gaze, Audrey promises she is not executing another dramatic escape. She descends to the rocky shoreline, engulfed by the vicious wind. The camera captures Aldo standing immobile, submerged in his self-imposed exile. Without a word, he strips off his tailored jacket, draping it over her bare shoulders to block the freezing air. Audrey studies his face, questioning if he actually cares beneath his cynical facade. Aldo defensively scoffs, begging her not to destroy his villain persona today. He attempts a bitter joke about her history of fleeing altars, but Audrey shuts down the deflection. She asserts her presence is a refusal to let him fade into obscurity. This moment perfectly illustrates the essence of true loyalty. It requires walking into the cold to retrieve someone precisely when they are desperately trying to push the world away. Stick with me, because this is where the ice finally shatters. Audrey steps into Aldo's space, demanding to know if he is walking into that chapel as family or as a threat. Aldo throws up his armor, asking what happens if he chooses to be the enemy. Audrey doesn't flinch, telling him Silvio would lose a vital piece of his soul. That raw truth hits Aldo like a physical blow, and his cynical mask slips. He quietly asks if the ruthless boss actually cares. Audrey reminds him their shared blood is thicker than the violence between them. Aldo gives a fractured smile, asking her to pass along his RSVP. Audrey refuses, challenging him to walk through those doors himself. It proves a simple truth. Treat a broken man like a monster, and he will play the villain. Treat him like a brother, and he just might find his way home. The scene transitions as Audrey returns to the estate. Waiting by the heavy iron doors is Silvio. The man who holds the city by the throat stands rigidly, his knuckles stark white, quietly fighting his darkest shadows. Seeing the damp sand clinging to her dress, he forces a nervous smile, joking about her habit of vanishing before the vows. Audrey reaches out, wrapping her warm fingers around his clenched fist. She softly tells him she was never running away. She was out there, making sure his fractured family was whole before meeting him at the altar. Silvio closes his eyes, completely disarmed, and gently presses his lips to her knuckles in a gesture of absolute reverence. Here is a quiet truth. Real strength is never measured by the vast, violent empires you conquer. It is measured entirely by the broken pieces of people you manage to hold together. Inside the dim chapel, the atmosphere shifts. Hardened men with violent histories sit quietly, their throats tight with suppressed emotion. In the front row sits Aldo, finally present, his posture a quiet surrender. The heavy wooden doors slowly swing open. Years ago, the first time she wore white, Audrey was a terrified girl walking into enemy territory. Today, Silvio is not hunting her. The most dangerous man alive is simply standing still at the altar, waiting for a crime boss built on ruthless control. This stillness is a profound act of surrender. Taking his hands, he whispers that their first vows were a cold contract, but today is a conscious choice. Audrey smiles, telling him she is choosing her own fate. Life offers us this quiet mercy. You always have the power to pick up the pen and rewrite your ending, no matter how dark your earlier chapters were. The priest's final words echo, and Silvio pulls her close, kissing her like they are the only two breathing souls left on a burning earth. The reception bleeds into a shadowy summit, the air thick with the smoke of expensive cigars and the quiet murmurs of dangerous men. Michael slides like a heavy ledger across the table, cementing the empire as untouchable. One by one, the city's ghosts bow to the dawn. Then the music fades. Aldo steps from the crowd, and the room holds its breath. His hands are empty. The bitter smirk is gone. He walks toward his brother, pausing to catch Audrey's eye, offering a silent thank you for pulling him from the edge. Let's look at this together, because the truth here is striking. You can buy obedience with sheer terror, but genuine respect is only ever earned through grace. Aldo holds his older brother's gaze, his voice dropping into a gravelly whisper. He admits he spent his entire life confusing their shared, brutal trauma with a twisted birthright. He finally calls Silvio the boss, refusing to live as a hollow ghost in his shadow any longer. The ruthless Don reaches out, gripping Aldo's shoulder with bruising affection, telling him to take his rightful place. Aldo touches the family crest, quietly burying decades of toxic poison. Later, Michael slips a file onto the desk. An old rival tried to ruin the wedding, but Aldo handled the threat in the shadows. When questioned, Aldo merely smirks, saying the man talked too much. The lesson here is quiet but profound. True security isn't about dodging every bullet yourself. It's having someone fiercely loyal standing in the dark, catching them for you. Audrey watches this quiet surrender, realizing Aldo chose his family long before swearing the blood oath. His calculating eyes drop downward. He notices the fiercely protective, desperate way Silvio's hand rests against Audrey's stomach. The infamous hitman stops breathing as the truth clicks into place. A slow, amused grin spreads across his face as he playfully mocks his brother's defensive posture. Silvio's shoulders instantly go rigid, ready for a violent fight. But Audrey steps in with a soft smile, gently telling Uncle Aldo to watch his foul language. That innocent title hits the hardened killer like a freight train, entirely stripping away his violent armor. He mutters a sarcastic joke about the kid being doomed, but his dark eyes shine with unshed emotion. Sometimes, the best way to disarm a deeply damaged soul is simply to offer them a permanent seat at your table. Silvio growls a low warning, telling his brother that if the child repeats his trash, there will be a heavy price. Aldo just smirks, his chest rising with an unfamiliar sense of family pride. The violent months finally fade into a bright, golden afternoon. We see a new hospital wing, bearing the name of the mother they lost to the cold streets so long ago. In a quiet act of mercy, Silvio pulled the strings so Arthur Palmer could keep his diner. Standing outside, Audrey feels a sudden flutter beneath her ribs. Silvio places his scarred hand over hers, utterly wrecked by a profound peace he never thought he deserved. Nearby, Aldo leans against a black sedan, failing miserably at looking tough. You and I have reached the end of this road together. The ultimate victory isn't just surviving the long war. It's building a deeply rooted place where love can finally grow. Fast forward through the storm of their brutal past, and the camera finds Silvio staring up at a hand-painted sign. He turns to Audrey, his voice thick with emotion, telling her she brought his mother's legacy back into the light. She looks up, asking softly if the terrifying crime boss is still afraid of the dark. Silvio lets his heavy armor drop. He openly admits that he lives in fear daily, but is finally learning to stop using control as a weapon. Naturally, Aldo breaks the tender mood, laughing that if the baby inherits Silvio's miserable charm, they are all doomed. He playfully calls the baby Dante, but Audrey fiercely replies her son's name is Leon. Silvio chuckles deeply, joking that a Don should be consulted. You and I have probably both learned this the hard way. True emotional healing means dropping your heavy armor and trusting the ones you love. The camera pushes in close as Silvio rests his scarred hand against Audrey's stomach, warm as he jokes about naming his son. Aldo dramatically clutches his chest, pretending to be heartbroken the boy won't be named. Dante. Audrey actually throws her head back and laughs. That bright sound cuts right through all the heavy blood and dark betrayal we've examined. Think about the terrifying path she walked. She stumbled into this violent empire barefoot in a torn wedding dress. Now, she wears the Don's ring, carries his heir, and rules the shadowy underworld without a single thought of running away. Eustace, she stopped fearing the dark and learned how to command it. We all have that hidden resilience waiting to be tested. Thank you for walking through this story with me tonight. Stay safe and remember, sometimes the very storm that was meant to destroy you ends up being exactly what sets you free. Audrey's transformation is visually dramatic. She moves from a muddy wedding dress to black gowns, emerald satin, heels, diamonds, and the image of a woman who looks like she belongs in the Gallo Empire. But the deeper lesson is that reinvention is not about loathers alone. The wardrobe gives her a new appearance, but her true transformation happens inside. When Audrey burns her wedding dress, She is not simply destroying fabric. She's rejecting the version of herself that tried to be small enough for Max. The fire becomes a symbol of release. The white dress represented a future built on obedience, image, and emotional imprisonment. Watching it burn allows Audrey to mark the end of one identity and the beginning of another. This is an important educational lesson. People sometimes need rituals of closure in order to move forward. A person leaving a painful relationship or harmful past may need to consciously release old expectations, old shame, and old labels. However, the story also warns that transformation should not become performance only. Audrey looks like a queen at the dinner table, but she must also learn how to think, speak, and act like someone who owns herself. Her strength is shown not in the dress, but in the way she challenges Aldo, confronts Silvio, and refuses to let either brother define her. Reinvention means remembering the parts of yourself that were buried under fear. It means learning to stand differently, speak differently, and make choices from confidence instead of survival. The educational value is strong. Changing your appearance can help you feel powerful, but real change comes when your inner voice changes too. Audrey's new clothes may make her look like trouble, but her real power is that she finally believes she is not someone to be managed.